Some commanders are remembered because they were loud, outrageous, and theatrical. Hasso von Manteuffel was remembered for the opposite reason, because he was quiet and deadly. While others barked orders from safe distances, Manteuffel stood beside tank commanders, inside burning steel coffins. While other generals lectured on theory, he learnt from tracks grinding over frozen earth, from engines coughing in snow, from the smell of oil and cordite drifting through shattered villages. He was aristocratic in background, yes, but far from the stereotype. He did not hide behind maps, he did not surround himself with ceremony. Soldiers followed him because he followed them into mud, into fire, into situations that sane men tried desperately to avoid. On the Eastern Front, where warfare swallowed entire armies and turned cities into graveyards, he became known by a name whispered with respect, the Panzer Baron. Hasso von Manteuffel had not been destined for armour. He came from the cavalry from horses, parade grounds, sabre drills, but the world changed. Horses died under tank tracks. The future roared on diesel engines. Instead of resisting, he adapted faster than almost any German officer. Manteuffel saw tanks not as replacements for cavalry, but as its evolution. Speed, mobility, penetration, the essence of shock. And unlike aristocrats who clung to old doctrine, he embraced the chaos of modern, mechanized war. On the Eastern Front, where the land stretches wider than imagination and winter kills before bullets do, Manteuffel proved himself not with speeches, but with results. When his units were surrounded, he fought his way out. When bridges collapsed, he rebuilt new ones under artillery fire. When tanks froze solid, he ordered fires built beneath their engines to thaw them. His command style shocked both subordinates and superiors. He was constantly present. He did not bark orders from a distant command post. He climbed onto the hull of a tank and shouted through the hatch. He believed that tanks fought best like wolves moving fast, striking unexpectedly, slipping away before the enemy reacted. His battalions became razor-sharp instruments, quick, precise, relentless. During the battles around the Dnieper, his panzers maneuvered through villages and river crossings, while Soviet artillery turned everything into ash. Manteuffel counterattacked with such speed that Soviet staff officers thought multiple divisions were attacking, when in reality it was just him, moving faster than logic allowed, stitching chaos into temporary advantage. When the German situation collapsed into retreat, Manteuffel did what few commanders in that war achieved. He withdrew without disintegration. He always brought his men back. Not victory, but survival. It may be the hardest thing a commander can achieve. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, the last German offensive, the last throw of loaded dice. Hitler needed a general who could make miracles out of nothing. Not a fanatic, not a politician, a professional. He chose Manteuffel. The Panzer Baron led 5th Panzer Army through the snowy Ardennes and accomplished what others could not. He broke through the American lines. His units advanced farther than any other German force during the offensive. But he knew something Hitler refused to admit. Fuel is stronger than willpower. Tanks without fuel are monuments. Machinery without supply is scrap metal. Manteuffel begged to shift the attack toward logistical targets, to take what could be taken, but Hitler demanded reliance on destiny, not logic. Manteuffel did not believe in destiny. He believed in results. When the Bulge collapsed, Manteuffel once again pulled off the impossible. He extracted his forces intact. Even as the Reich fell apart, leadership fraying, morale collapsing, cities burning, Manteuffel retained control. Other generals lost armies. Manteuffel preserved them. At war's end, he surrendered, stood trial, and later entered politics, something unheard of among major German generals. In Parliament, he argued not about glory or nostalgia, but about the future of European defence. Even his political opponents admitted he was pragmatic, focused, clear, a military mind that sought purpose, not myth. History makes one thing clear. Hasso von Manteuffel was not a servant of ideology, he was a servant of efficiency. He did not worship Hitler, he did not preach fanaticism. He believed in mobility, speed, adaptability, and the lives of the soldiers under his command. but history judges not only skill, it judges allegiance. The Panzer Baron proved that brilliance in the hands of the wrong regime becomes tragedy rather than triumph. Tonight, we return to the freezing forests, the burning plains, the shattered bridges, to the battles where he shaped impossibility into temporary order. Speed was his weapon. Survival was his art. War was his canvas. This is the entire history of Hasso von Manteuffel, the cavalryman who became a master of tanks, the aristocrat who refused privilege, and the Panzer Baron who shaped the last breath of a collapsing war. Before we dive in, I want to imagine you for a moment. Where are you right now, physically, in this moment? Are you lying under blankets in a quiet room, listening as the night slows down? Or are you somewhere wide awake, maybe sitting at a desk, escaping the noise of your day with history? And what time is it where you are listening from? I love knowing the tiny details, the time, the place, the mood, because it reminds me that these stories are reaching real people across distance and silence. And if these long, slow journeys through history help you unwind, think, or fall asleep a little easier, consider subscribing. It tells me that these deep, patient explorations matter to someone, and it keeps me inspired to continue creating more. January 14, 1897, Potsdam, Prussia. In the shadow of the Garnison Kirche, where Frederick the Great lay entombed beneath Prussian battle standards, a child entered a world already preparing for war. The midwife wrapped the infant in linen bearing the family crest, 3 generations old, stained with the blood of warriors who had served kings. Outside, cavalry officers in gleaming cuirasses rode past, their sabres catching winter light. The boy's father, a decorated hussar, stood at the window in full-dress uniform, watching the Kaiser's own Guard regiment drill in the square below. He did not yet know that his son, this small thing barely drawing breath, would one day command armies that would shake continents. He did not know that this child, born into certainty, would live to see that certainty shattered 3 times over. Hasso von Manteuffel came into the world as the 19th century died and the 20th prepared its slaughter. His family name carried weight in Prussia, the kind of weight measured in military generations rather than mere wealth. His great-uncle, Field Marshal Edwin von Manteuffel, had helped forge the German Empire through 3 wars. His tactical genius, instrumental in the victories that made Bismarck's unification possible. The family estate held portraits of officers stretching back to the Napoleonic Wars, each face stern beneath pickelhaube helmets or elegant shakos, each man having led men to death in service of throne and fatherland. Young Hasso grew up walking corridors where every painting, every medal case, every leather-bound regimental history whispered the same message. You were born to command, born to serve, born to continue a tradition older than living memory. But this was no mere aristocratic pretension. The Prussian military tradition that shaped Hasso's childhood was the most sophisticated warfare academy on earth. While other nations treated soldiering as a gentleman's hobby or a peasant's burden, Prussia had transformed it into a science. The Kriegsakademie in Berlin produced staff officers whose theoretical knowledge of logistics, tactics, and operational planning exceeded anything the French or British could match. The general staff system, refined over decades, created institutional military knowledge that survived beyond individual commanders. Young Prussian officers studied Clausewitz and Moltke the way seminary students studied scripture, memorizing principles of concentration of force, interior lines, and the decisive battle. Hasso absorbed this culture from birth, learning military geography before he learned literature, understanding the Franco-Prussian War's battles before he understood its politics. His childhood unfolded in an empire at its zenith, confident and powerful and utterly blind to the catastrophe approaching. Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany was an industrial giant, producing steel and chemicals and precision machinery that made it the envy of Europe. The army that paraded through Potsdam's streets numbered 500,000 men in peacetime, expandable to millions through a mobilization system of terrifying efficiency. Hasso watched these parades from his father's shoulders, watched the field artillery thunder past with their quick-firing guns, watched the infantry march in perfect precision, watched the cavalry, always the cavalry, those magnificent horsemen in their elaborate uniforms who represented everything beautiful and doomed about the old world. At age 11, he attended his first Grand Review, standing beside his father as the Kaiser himself rode past on a white stallion, and in that moment, Hasso knew with absolute certainty what he would become. Then the world shattered. August 1914 brought mobilization orders that sent Germany's armies crashing into Belgium and France, convinced that the Schlieffen Plan's careful calculations would deliver victory in weeks. Hasso, too young for service at 17, watched his cousins and older friends march away singing patriotic songs, certain of glory. The letters came back from the Western Front describing something no one had anticipated, a kind of industrial slaughter that turned Prussian tactical excellence into mere fodder for machine guns and artillery. His father returned from command on the Eastern Front in 1916, his Hussar regiment having been dismounted and sent into the trenches because cavalry had no function in this new war. The old officer never spoke of what he saw, but Hasso noticed how his hands shook when thunder rolled across the estate. By 1918, when Hasso volunteered for military service, the war had devoured 2 million German soldiers, the blockade was starving civilians, and the Kaiser's empire was collapsing from within. November 1918. Hasso von Manteuffel, 21 years old, stood in the courtyard of a Potsdam barracks and watched the German Empire die. Revolutionary sailors and workers' councils had seized control of the city. Red flags flew where imperial eagles had perched. The Soldiers' Council declared the war over, the Kaiser abdicated, fled to Holland like a coward, and centuries of Hohenzollern rule ended not with Wagnerian drama but with pathetic whimpering. Hasso watched officers strip off their rank insignia to avoid being assaulted by their own men. He watched soldiers elect committees to decide what orders they would follow. The entire structure that had defined his life, the hierarchy and discipline and certainty, dissolved in days. His father, the decorated Hussar, shut himself in his study and wept. The world, Hasso had been bred for, no longer existed. But he did not break. Where many aristocratic officers fled military service entirely, unable to stomach serving a republic, Hasso made a pragmatic calculation. Germany had been humiliated, reduced to a fraction of its power, but it still existed. The Treaty of Versailles limited the new Reichswehr to 100,000 men, forbade tanks and aircraft and heavy artillery, prohibited the general staff system that had made Prussian military excellence possible. Yet within these constraints, the Reichswehr became something extraordinary, an army of professionals where every private soldier was trained as a potential sergeant, every sergeant as a potential officer. Hasso joined this new army in 1921, accepting a lieutenant's commission in a cavalry regiment, knowing even then that cavalry's days were numbered, but choosing it anyway because it represented continuity with everything he valued. The 1920s were lean years, years of hidden preparation. The Reichswehr's limitations forced innovation. Since Germany could not maintain large forces openly, it maintained small forces with exceptional training. Hasso attended the Kriegsakademie, now officially disbanded, but continuing secretly under different names, where he studied the war's lessons. The lectures analysed how mobile warfare had given way to static trench warfare, how artillery had become the war's true killing arm, how tanks, used properly by the British and French in 1918, had finally restored movement to battle. Most importantly, Hasso learned what few Allied officers understood. The next war would be won by whoever could avoid the trenches entirely, who could restore manoeuvre and speed and operational depth to warfare. The cavalry officer began to see beyond his horses. In 1926, something happened that would define the next phase of Hasso's education, though he could not know it then. Germany and the Soviet Union, both international pariahs, signed secret military cooperation agreements. Far from European eyes, in remote Soviet facilities, German officers tested the tanks and aircraft the treaty forbade them. The Kazan Tank School in Russia became Germany's hidden laboratory, where Reichswehr officers experimented with armoured warfare, theory while officially their nation possessed no tanks at all. Hasso never attended Kazan himself, but the officers who did returned with revolutionary ideas, concepts of deep penetration and combined arms operations that would later be called blitzkrieg. He listened to their after-hours discussions in Berlin cafes, these men describing how tanks could accomplish what cavalry never could. breakthrough and exploitation at operational depths, moving faster than enemy reserves could respond. By 1934, when Hasso von Manteuffel first sat in the commander's cupola of a Panzer I during secret exercises, he understood that his entire military education had been preparation for this moment. The tank was absurdly small, its armour barely thick enough to stop rifle bullets, its main armament nothing more than machine guns. But it moved. It could cross trenches that would stop horses. It could provide mobile firepower that cavalry sabres could not. Most importantly, massed together and used aggressively. It could restore what barbed wire and machine guns had taken away. The decisive breakthrough, the war of movement, the possibility of victory through manoeuvre rather than attrition. The Prussian cavalry tradition that had shaped Hasso's youth was dead, killed by industrial warfare. But standing in that cramped metal box, vision blocks giving him a narrow view of the training ground, Hasso felt something he had not felt since before the trenches swallowed Europe. He felt possibility. At 37 years old, scarred by one world war, he was ready to excel in the next. September 1, 1939. 4:55 in the morning, German-Polish border near the Water River. Captain Hasso von Manteuffel crouched in the turret of his reconnaissance vehicle, watching the horizon lighten from black to grey. Behind him, the entire 7th Panzer Division waited in attack formation, engines idling, exhaust creating artificial fog in the dawn chill. The tension was electric. For 20 years, Germany had been forbidden this moment, forbidden tanks and forbidden war and forbidden revenge for Versailles. Now the Wehrmacht was about to unleash what 2 decades of secret preparation had created. At precisely 04:45, artillery began its work. The sound was not the rolling thunder of World War I's preparatory barrages, those days-long bombardments that warned the enemy exactly where the attack would come. This was a short, sharp shock. 45 minutes of concentrated fire, designed to stun rather than destroy. Then the signal came. Cross the border, begin the war. The first hours revealed both the promise and chaos of Germany's new way of war. Manteuffel's reconnaissance company crossed into Poland ahead of the main force, probing for enemy positions, reporting back via radio, the wireless sets that gave German commanders situational awareness their grandfathers could never have imagined. The Polish border guards fought, briefly, then fell back. The reconnaissance pushed on. By mid-morning, Manteuffel's vehicles had penetrated 15 kilometers into Poland, moving faster than any army had moved in the last war. But already the problems appeared. Vehicles broke down on the rough roads. Radio communication failed in forests. The promised Stuka dive bombers that were supposed to appear like avenging angels struck Polish columns, but also, twice, struck German reconnaissance units whose positions had been incorrectly reported. War, Manteuffel noted in his field journal, remained chaos regardless of how modern your equipment. Yet the speed was intoxicating. By September 8, 7 days into the campaign, Manteuffel's reconnaissance elements were approaching Warsaw, having covered over 200 kilometers. The Polish army, brave and well-led, could not cope with the tempo. They prepared defensive positions, only to find German panzers had bypassed them entirely, cutting communications surrounding entire divisions from behind. This was the theory made real. Breakthrough and exploitation, moving through the enemy's rear faster than his commanders could react. Manteuffel saw Polish cavalry units, magnificent horsemen with lances and sabres, attempting to defend river crossings. The machine guns of German armoured cars cut them down before they could close to melee range. It was horrible and necessary and instructive. This, Manteuffel understood with absolute clarity, was what had happened to his father's generation in the trenches. Technology had made traditional valour obsolete. The campaign lasted 35 days. Poland ceased to exist as a state, partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union in a cynical recreation of 18th century diplomacy. The Wehrmacht had achieved something extraordinary, a decisive victory through mobile warfare, avoiding the years-long stalemate that had defined the last war. But the cost had been higher than propaganda admitted. The 7th Panzer Division, Manteuffel's unit, had suffered 27% casualties in 5 weeks of fighting. Vehicles broke down at alarming rates, with mechanical failures causing more losses than enemy action. The logistics system, theoretically modernised, still relied heavily on horses, millions of them, because Germany simply did not have enough trucks to supply mechanized divisions over long distances. Most tellingly, the Panzer Division's light tanks had proven vulnerable even to Polish anti-tank guns. The Panzer I and Panzer II, which formed the bulk of Germany's armour, were essentially training vehicles pressed into combat because Germany had not yet built enough real tanks. These lessons shaped the Wehrmacht's preparation for Case Yellow, the attack on France scheduled for May 1940. Manteuffel, promoted to major, found himself in training command, helping prepare new reconnaissance battalions for the coming campaign. The winter of 1939 to 1940 became a period of furious adaptation. Tactics were rewritten based on Polish experience. The realization that pure armoured penetrations could be cut off from behind led to the concept of Panzer Grenadiers, mechanised infantry who could keep pace with tanks and provide close support. Radio procedures were refined. Maintenance protocols improved. Most importantly, operational planning became bolder. The original Case Yellow had been a rehash of the old Schlieffen plan, a broad sweep through the Low Countries. Then, Erich von Manstein proposed something audacious. Concentrate the panzer divisions in the Ardennes forest, terrain everyone assumed was impenetrable to armour, and strike directly at the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in half. May 15, 1940. The Netherlands had already fallen. Belgium was collapsing. Now came the decisive moment. At Sedan, where the Meuse River formed France's natural defensive barrier, Heinz Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps prepared to cross. Manteuffel, attached to the operation as a liaison officer, watched from a forward observation post as the attack unfolded. First came the Stukas, screaming down with that psychologically devastating siren, bombing French bunkers into rubble. Then assault boats, Wehrmacht infantry paddling across under fire, establishing a bridgehead while engineers worked frantically to build pontoon bridges strong enough for tanks. By afternoon, panzers were crossing. By evening, the breakout had begun. The French had concentrated their forces in Belgium, expecting the main blow there. Instead, German armour was erupting from the Ardennes into their rear, cutting supply lines, spreading panic, moving faster than French commanders could comprehend. The race to the Channel revealed both the genius and the fragility of blitzkrieg. Guderian's panzers covered 200 kilometres in 7 days, reaching the coast and trapping the British Expeditionary Force and France's best divisions in a pocket around Dunkirk. But on May 21, something happened that gave Manteuffel nightmares for months afterward. Near Arras, a British counterattack with fewer than 100 tanks nearly cut the German corridor in half. The British Matilda tanks, properly armoured unlike Germany's light panzers, shrugged off German anti-tank fire. Only the intervention of Luftwaffe Stukas and German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, pressed into anti-tank service, stopped the breakthrough. Manteuffel studied the after-action reports obsessively. The lesson was clear. Germany's tactical superiority and operational audacity had won the campaign, but the victory rested on fragile foundations. The panzers were not invincible. Supply lines could be cut. A determined enemy with proper equipment could disrupt everything. Paris fell on June 14. France signed an armistice on June 22. In 6 weeks, Germany had accomplished what 4 years of World War I could not: the decisive defeat of France. The Wehrmacht's prestige soared to mythical heights. Hitler seemed a military genius. The Blitzkrieg doctrine appeared to have solved the riddle of modern war. Manteuffel, promoted again and decorated for his role in the French campaign, found himself less euphoric than his comrades. He had seen too much. The victory had depended on French mistakes as much as German excellence. The British had escaped at Dunkirk because Hitler, inexplicably, had halted the panzers for 3 days. The Luftwaffe, which had seemed invincible, had failed to prevent the evacuation of over 300,000 Allied soldiers. Most importantly, Britain had not surrendered. The war would continue. Through the summer and fall of 1940, while Hitler planned an invasion of Britain that never came, Manteuffel digested the lessons of 2 campaigns. He understood now that Blitzkrieg was not a magic formula, but a set of operational principles. Concentrate armour at the decisive point, break through and exploit before the enemy can respond, maintain tempo to prevent stabilisation, use combined arms to overwhelm enemy defences. But he also understood the limitations. Blitzkrieg required an enemy who would cooperate by deploying incorrectly, required relatively short distances because German logistics could not sustain deep operations for extended periods. Against Poland, with its exposed geography and obsolete military, it had worked brilliantly. Against France, psychologically defeated before the first shot, it had worked despite near disasters. Against an enemy who would not break, on terrain that did not favour rapid movement, facing an opponent with unlimited space to retreat, the Blitzkrieg might fail. Manteuffel hoped, with a kind of desperate intensity, that Germany would not be foolish enough to test that hypothesis against the Soviet Union. In June 1941, his hopes died, along with 3 million other things. June 22, 1941, 3:05 in the morning, German-Soviet frontier near Grodno. The darkness exploded. 3,000 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along a 1,000-kilometre front, the largest military barrage in history, tearing apart the Soviet positions. Major Hasso von Manteuffel, now commanding a reconnaissance battalion of the 7th Panzer Division, sat in his command vehicle, listening to the hurricane of shells passing overhead. Around him, his battalion waited in attack formation, engines idling, every man knowing that in minutes they would cross into the Soviet Union and begin a campaign that dwarfed anything they had experienced in Poland or France. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's gamble to destroy the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign, was beginning. The artillery fire lifted. Signal flares arced into the pre-dawn sky. Manteuffel gave the order: forward into Russia, forward into the abyss. The first day seemed to confirm German expectations. Soviet border guards, caught completely by surprise despite months of warnings from their intelligence services, collapsed. Manteuffel's reconnaissance elements pushed 40 kilometers into Soviet territory by nightfall, encountering disorganized resistance, entire Soviet divisions simply evaporating as German armor rolled past them. The Wehrmacht's aerial reconnaissance reported scenes of chaos. Soviet aircraft destroyed on the ground, supply depots burning, columns of prisoners already overwhelming the capacity to guard them. That night, reviewing intelligence reports at his mobile command post, Manteuffel allowed himself to believe the High Command's promises. Perhaps this would be like Poland, like France. Perhaps Soviet resistance would crumble. Perhaps the Wehrmacht would be in Moscow by September. He fell asleep to the sound of distant gunfire, exhausted and hopeful. Reality began intruding by July. The 7th Panzer Division reached Minsk, 250 kilometers into Soviet territory, and helped close a massive encirclement that trapped 300,000 Soviet soldiers, a victory by any measure. But Manteuffel noticed something that official reports barely mentioned. Beyond Minsk, Soviet resistance was not collapsing but intensifying. Radio intercepts revealed new Soviet armies forming units that German intelligence had not known existed. The prisoners taken at Minsk were poorly trained, poorly equipped, but they had fought with suicidal courage, defending positions long after any rational calculation said to retreat. Most disturbing, Manteuffel's reconnaissance patrols were encountering a new Soviet tank, a design intelligence officers insisted could not exist in operational numbers. The 34 had sloped armour that German 37mm anti-tank guns could not penetrate. Its 76mm gun could destroy any German tank from ranges where German guns were useless. And it was fast. With wide tracks that handled Russian roads better than German vehicles designed for European highways, August brought the first real crisis. Near Smolensk, 300 kilometers from Moscow, Manteuffel's reconnaissance battalion ran into a Soviet counterattack, spearheaded by 34 tanks. The encounter lasted 20 minutes and shattered Manteuffel's assumptions about German technical superiority. His light tanks and armoured cars could not hurt the Soviet tanks. The anti-tank guns his infantry deployed bounced shells off the sloped armour. Only a few Panzer IV tanks with short-barreled 75mm guns managed to score damaging hits, and only from the flanks at close range. Soviet tanks rolled through German positions, crushing anti-tank guns under their treads, machine-gunning infantry, immune to everything except lucky hits or close assault by engineers with demolition charges. The attack failed only because Soviet coordination was poor and German artillery, the Wehrmacht's most reliable arm, broke up the assault with massed fire. Manteuffel counted his losses afterward. 12 vehicles destroyed, 37 men dead, 58 wounded. For the first time since Poland, he had been outfought, not by superior tactics, but by superior equipment. The autumn Rasputitsa, the season of mud, nearly destroyed the Wehrmacht without the Soviets firing a shot. In October, the autumn rains began. Within days, Russian roads became rivers of liquid mud that swallowed vehicles whole. Manteuffel watched supply trucks sink to their axles, then to their fenders, then disappear entirely. Tanks trying to advance off-road managed 100 meters an hour, their engines overheating from the strain, their crews exhausted from fighting the vehicle as much as the enemy. The distance from German railheads to the front line now exceeded 1,000 kilometers. Horses, which everyone had assumed were obsolete, became more valuable than trucks because they could actually move in the mud. The 7th Panzer Division, theoretically a mechanized formation, ground to a halt 40 kilometers from its objectives, immobilized by terrain rather than combat. Manteuffel organized scavenging parties to strip Soviet trucks and horses from destroyed units, abandoning German doctrine entirely in favor of anything that worked. November brought another revelation. The Wehrmacht was not equipped for Russian winter. Manteuffel's battalion, like every German unit, had been issued standard uniforms designed for temperate European climates. When temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius in early November, soldiers began suffering frostbite casualties at alarming rates. Vehicle engines froze overnight and cracked. Machine guns jammed because their lubricating oil congealed. Artillery recoil mechanisms seized. The logistics system, barely functional in autumn mud, collapsed entirely on frozen roads. Manteuffel requisitioned civilian winter clothing from occupied villages, ordered his men to strip winter gear from Soviet dead, did everything forbidden by regulations to keep his unit functional. Headquarters sent messages reminding him that such actions violated the dignity of the Wehrmacht. Manteuffel ignored these messages. His men needed winter boots more than they needed dignity. December 5, 1941. The temperature dropped to -35 Celsius. Soviet radio traffic, which German intelligence had been monitoring, suddenly spiked. Then, along the entire front from Leningrad to Ukraine, the Red Army counterattacked. Fresh Soviet divisions, equipped and trained for winter warfare, fell on German positions held by frozen, exhausted soldiers. The great offensive that was supposed to end in Moscow by September had stalled on the city's outskirts. Now, suddenly, the Wehrmacht found itself fighting for survival. Near Kalinin, Manteuffel's reconnaissance battalion held a village that controlled a vital crossroads. Soviet infantry wearing white winter camouflage and ski troops moving with terrifying speed, attacked for 3 days. The Germans held, barely, but at crushing cost. By December 10th, Manteuffel's battalion numbered 470 men, down from 850 in June. His vehicles, those that still functioned, had been cobbled together from 3 different models using salvaged parts. He commanded a unit in name only. The winter of 1941 to 1942 taught Manteuffel lessons that would define his remaining service. First, the Red Army, for all its initial chaos and tactical incompetence, possessed 2 qualities that made it nearly unbeatable: depth and resilience. Germany could win every battle and still lose the campaign, because the Soviet Union simply had more space, more people, more resources. Second, logistics mattered more than tactics. The most brilliant maneuver meant nothing if your trucks could not deliver ammunition. Third, in warfare, between industrial powers, material superiority ultimately triumphed over tactical excellence. Germany's soldiers were better trained, better led, more tactically sophisticated than their Soviet counterparts. But the Red Army had 34 tanks that German weapons could not kill, had winter gear that kept their soldiers fighting while Germans froze, had supply lines measured in kilometers rather than thousands of kilometers. Fourth, and most disturbing, this was not a war Germany could win. The mathematics were pitiless. Even if the Wehrmacht had captured Moscow, even if Army Group South had taken the Caucasus oil fields, the Soviet Union would have continued fighting from beyond the Urals. Manteuffel did not share this conclusion with anyone. Such thoughts, if spoken aloud, could earn a firing squad. But he knew. He had seen the endless Russian steppe, had fought an enemy that absorbed catastrophic losses and kept attacking. Germany had awakened something terrible. February 1943, Normandy, France. Hasso von Manteuffel stood on the turret of a Panther tank, watching his new command assemble in the French countryside. The 7th Panzer Division, Erwin Rommel's legendary Ghost Division from the French campaign, now belonged to him. But the unit he inherited was a ghost in more ways than name. The division that had raced across France in 1940 had been ground down to fragments in Russia. The men parading before him were replacements and veterans mixed in roughly equal measure, the veterans recognisable by their hollow eyes and the way they flinched at loud noises. The equipment was equally mixed, brand new Panther tanks with teething problems that made them as dangerous to their crews as to the enemy. Older Panzer IV tanks upgraded with long-barreled 75mm guns, captured Soviet vehicles filling gaps in the transport column. Manteuffel's orders were straightforward. Rebuild this unit into a fighting force, because by summer it would return to Russia. He had 6 months to forge an effective division from this collection of survivors and novices. The challenge was complicated by Germany's deteriorating strategic position. In February 1943, the 6th Army surrendered at Stalingrad, 200,000 men lost, the myth of Wehrmacht, invincibility shattered. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps was being pushed back toward Tunisia, the Desert War clearly lost. In Russia, the Red Army's winter offensive had recaptured vast territories, and Soviet tank production had reached levels that made German armoured strength look pitiful by comparison. The Wehrmacht was transitioning from blitzkrieg to strategic defence, from attacker to defender, and the psychological adjustment was wrenching. Officers who had learned warfare as an offensive art now had to master fighting withdrawal and defensive operations. Manteuffel, drawing on his Russian experience, understood this transition better than most. Defence, properly conducted, was not passive. It was aggressive economization of force, trading space for time, mauling attackers while preserving your own strength for counterattacks at the decisive moment. August 1943, the 7th Panzer Division returned to the Eastern Front, deployed to the Myas River sector in southern Ukraine. Within days, Manteuffel faced the baptism every new division commander dreaded: a major Soviet offensive. Operation Rumiantsev hit his sector with overwhelming force, 5 Soviet armies attacking to recapture Kharkov. The numbers were staggering. Soviet artillery preparation lasted 6 hours, more shells than Germany expended in a month, falling on a 30-kilometre front. Then came the tanks. Waves of 34s and new heavy KV-1 tanks, over 400 armoured vehicles in the first assault alone. Manteuffel's division numbered 67 tanks total. The mathematics suggested annihilation. But mathematics alone did not determine battles. Manteuffel had spent 6 months drilling his division in a defensive doctrine he called the box. When Soviet tanks penetrated German lines, as they inevitably would given their numerical superiority, German positions would not collapse but contract into hedgehog defensive zones. Infantry held the perimeter with Panzerfausts and anti-tank guns. Artillery, pre-registered on likely approach routes, could be called instantly. Tanks positioned in the centre of the box could respond to threats from any direction. The key was communication radios linking every element so that isolated strongpoints became nodes in a coordinated defence rather than targets for piecemeal destruction. When Soviet armour broke through on August 14th, Manteuffel's division executed exactly this defence. Soviet tanks found themselves channeled into killing grounds where German anti-tank guns fired from multiple directions simultaneously. The legendary 88mm guns, both anti-aircraft and anti-tank variants, destroyed Soviet armour at ranges where return fire was impossible. Panther tanks, when they functioned, proved capable of engaging 34s frontally for the first time. The Myas River battles lasted 3 weeks and cost both sides hideously. The 7th Panzer Division claimed 240 Soviet tanks destroyed, a figure Manteuffel suspected was inflated by double counting and misidentification, but nonetheless reflected genuine success. Yet the division could not hold. The Soviets simply kept coming, replacing losses overnight with reserves German commanders could not match. By September, Manteuffel received orders to conduct fighting withdrawal to the Dnieper River, 200 kilometers west. The retreat order came as relief and humiliation simultaneously. Relief because his division was nearly combat ineffective after 3 weeks of constant battle. Humiliation because retreat violated everything Prussian military, tradition taught about holding ground. The withdrawal to the Dnieper showcased Manteuffel's gift for operational improvisation. Retreating under pressure from a numerically superior enemy was among warfare's most difficult operations, requiring perfect timing and coordination to avoid retreat becoming rout. Manteuffel organized his division into 3 echelons. The rear guard, heavy on anti-tank weapons and combat engineers, held successive defensive lines for 12 to 24 hours, delaying Soviet pursuit. The main body moved at night, preserving vehicles and avoiding Soviet air attack. The advance guard seized river crossings and prepared demolitions, ensuring the pursuing Soviets would face obstacles at every water barrier. Most innovatively, Manteuffel used Soviet tactics against them, infiltration attacks and night operations that exploited Red Army weaknesses in small unit coordination. German reconnaissance detachments would slip behind Soviet advance units at night, ambush supply columns, mine roads, create confusion out of proportion to their numbers. The Dnieper crossing, executed in late September, required evacuating 12,000 German soldiers across a 500-meter-wide river while Soviet forces attempted to interfere. Manteuffel's engineers built pontoon bridges at night, camouflaged them during the day, and defended them with concentrated anti-aircraft fire that deterred Soviet aircraft. The division crossed in 72 hours, then destroyed the bridges behind them. Soviet forces arrived at the riverbank to find every crossing demolished, every ferry boat sunk. The Germans dug in on the western shore with clear fields of fire. The operation was tactically masterful and strategically meaningless. Germany was losing the war, but at least Manteuffel had saved his division to fight again. November 1943. Near Zhytomyr, the pattern repeated. Soviet forces broke through neighbouring divisions, encircling the 7th. Panzer in a pocket with 6 other German units. For 72 hours, Manteuffel conducted defense against attacks from all directions. Soviet infantry probed constantly, searching for weak points. Soviet artillery pounded positions around the clock. Soviet tanks attempted breakthrough at multiple locations simultaneously. The Germans held, but barely. Then, on the night of November 19th, Manteuffel executed a breakout using tactics he had learned from studying Soviet operations. Instead of attacking at dawn with armor leading as German doctrine prescribed, he infiltrated infantry through Soviet lines during darkness, suppressing Soviet machine gun positions silently with close assault. At dawn, the tanks broke out through the gap the infantry had created, moving so fast that Soviet reserves could not react in time. The 7th Panzer escaped with 60% of its strength intact, while other encircled divisions were destroyed. January 22, 1944. Adolf Hitler personally summoned Manteuffel to the Wolfschanze in East Prussia and awarded him the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest decorations. The Führer, looking greyer and more stooped than Manteuffel remembered, praised him for saving his division from 6 separate Soviet encirclement attempts. Hitler asked about conditions at the front. Manteuffel, with unusual candor for a general addressing the Supreme Commander, described the material superiority Soviet forces enjoyed, the impossibility of holding against such numerical odds, the need for mobile defense rather than Hitler's fortress strategy. Hitler listened, nodded, said nothing about changing strategy, and dismissed him. Walking out of the Wolf's Lair, Manteuffel understood 2 things. First, Hitler recognized competence and rewarded it regardless of seniority or political connections, which meant talented officers could still rise. Second, Hitler would not change strategy regardless of what reality demonstrated, which meant Germany would lose the war. These two facts would define Manteufel's remaining service, doing brilliantly what would ultimately prove futile. February 1, 1944, East Prussia. The Grossdeutschland Panzer Grenadier Division was not merely an elite unit, it was the Wehrmacht's living showpiece. The division that received first peak of equipment and personnel, the unit foreign observers were shown when Germany wanted to demonstrate military excellence. When Hasso von Manteuffel assumed command, he inherited 22,000 men, over 60 Tiger and Panther tanks, more than 100 assault guns, artillery regiments with firepower exceeding most corps, and expectations that matched this lavish provision. Grossdeutschland existed to win decisive battles, to demonstrate what German training and equipment could accomplish when optimally combined. The division's combat record in Russia had been extraordinary, but it had also been extraordinarily costly. Manteuffel's predecessor had been relieved after losing a quarter of the division's strength in a single month. Headquarters made clear that Manteuffel was expected to maintain Grossdeutschland's elite status while avoiding its elite casualty rates. The contradiction inherent in this directive did not escape him. He had barely 2 months to assess his new command before being thrown into the crisis. In late March 1944, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive in Ukraine, aiming to recapture Odessa and drive into Romania, Germany's critical oil supplier. The Romanian front collapsed within days. Grossdeutschland received emergency deployment orders: move south, stop the Soviet breakthrough, hold the Târgu Frumos sector at all costs. The mission was complicated by Romania's military weakness. Romanian divisions, poorly equipped and demoralized by years of grinding losses, were disintegrating under Soviet pressure. Grossdeutschland would be holding 25 kilometers of front terrain that German doctrine said required 60 kilometers of rear depth for proper defense, with unreliable allies on both flanks. Manteuffel studied the maps during the train journey south and recognized the setup for another encirclement battle, May 12, 1944. The Soviet 2nd Tank Army, over 500 tanks strong, hit the Târgu Frumos sector. The attack came at dawn with overwhelming artillery preparation that destroyed German forward positions and severed communications with rear echelons. Soviet armor poured through the breaches, classic deep operations doctrine designed to penetrate, exploit, and encircle. But Manteuffel had anticipated exactly this assault. Unlike other German commanders who spread their forces evenly to hold every meter of ground, he had concentrated his strength in depth, creating what he called a three-dimensional defense. The forward line was deliberately light, designed to be penetrated. Behind it, concealed in tree lines and reverse slopes, waited the killing zones. Tiger tanks positioned to ambush Soviet armor from the flanks, 88mm anti-tank guns sighted with overlapping fields of fire, assault gun battalions ready to counterattack penetrations. The Soviets broke through the forward line and drove straight into the trap. The Battle of Târgu Frumos became a masterpiece of defensive warfare and a preview of the war's brutal mathematics. For 3 days, Soviet armor pushed into Manteuffel's defensive depth, and for 3 days German guns methodically destroyed them. Tiger tanks, firing from prepared positions at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, knocked out 34s before Soviet crews even identified the threat. German anti-tank guns, positioned to create crossfire zones, caught Soviet tanks in killing corridors where every route forward exposed their vulnerable flank armor. Manteuffel moved his mobile reserves with perfect timing, reinforcing threatened sectors, counterattacking penetrations before they could be exploited, withdrawing units before they could be encircled. The tactical execution was nearly flawless. Yet by May 15, when Soviet attacks finally subsided, Manteuffel's division claimed 350 Soviet tanks destroyed, while he himself had lost 47 tanks and assault guns. The Germans had won decisively, the Soviets had lost heavily, but Soviet tank production could replace those losses in a week, while Manteuffel's destroyed Tigers and Panthers were irreplaceable. May 20th brought a different kind of victory, the kind that Manteuffel had been perfecting since his days on the Maas River. Soviet forces, frustrated by their failures at Târgu Frumos, attempted a wider envelopment, trying to bypass Grossdeutschland's positions and cut the division off from behind. Manteuffel saw the maneuver developing through aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts. Instead of pulling back to avoid encirclement, he did something that violated every instinct of preservation. he deliberately allowed Soviet armor to penetrate past his flanks. The Soviet spearheads, thinking they had achieved breakthrough, drove deep into what they thought was the German rear. They found instead another prepared killing zone. Manteuffel had positioned his assault gun battalions and mobile infantry in concealed positions along the Soviet advance route. When the Soviet armor was fully committed, stretched out along narrow approach routes with their supply vehicles intermixed with combat units, Grossdeutschland struck from both flanks simultaneously. The resulting battle lasted 6 hours and annihilated 2 Soviet tank brigades. The tactical elegance was undeniable. The strategic futility was equally undeniable. For every Soviet unit Manteuffel destroyed, 3 more appeared. June 22, 1944. 3 years to the day after Operation Barbarossa began, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bagration, the destruction of German Army Group Center. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, over 5,000 tanks, supported by overwhelming air superiority, fell on German positions in Belorussia. In 4 days, the Soviets achieved what the Germans had done to France. In 1940, total operational collapse. Entire German armies ceased to exist. The Soviet advance covered 200 kilometers in 2 weeks. Hitler, watching his central front disintegrate, ordered Grossdeutschland rush north to stabilize the situation. Manteuffel received these orders with grim recognition. His division, the Wehrmacht's elite troubleshooter, was being thrown into another impossible situation. The movement north revealed the Wehrmacht's institutional decay. Grossdeutschland travelled by rail, but Soviet airstrikes forced constant detours and delays. Partisan attacks disrupted schedules. Fuel shortages required rationing that left combat vehicles with barely enough diesel to reach the front, none for manoeuvre once there. When the division finally detrained near Vilnius in Lithuania in mid-July, Manteuffel discovered the situation was worse than briefings suggested. Army Group Center had lost 28 divisions, over 350,000 men, in 3 weeks. The Soviet advance had created a gap 300 kilometers wide in German lines. Grossdeutschland, the mighty elite division, was being asked to plug this gap essentially alone. What followed was a masterpiece of fighting withdrawal that saved thousands of German soldiers and demonstrated both Manteuffel's tactical brilliance and the futility of tactical brilliance against strategic catastrophe. For 96 hours, from July 17th through July 20th, Grossdeutschland conducted a mobile defence across 150 kilometres of Lithuanian and East Prussian territory. Manteuffel organised his division into 3 combat groups that leapfrogged westward, each group defending for 12 hours while the others moved to the next defensive line. Soviet forces, pursuing aggressively, ran into each defensive position, expecting to find demoralised remnants. Instead, they found prepared defences with armour support and artillery coordination. The Soviets would deploy for attack, a process that took hours. By the time they were ready to assault, Grossdeutschland had already withdrawn to the next position. German combat engineers demolished bridges, mined roads, created obstacles that forced Soviet units to deploy off their march routes. German reconnaissance elements infiltrated behind Soviet lines, reporting enemy movements and ambushing supply columns. The cost of this fighting withdrawal was measured not just in casualties, but in exhaustion. By July 19th, Grossdeutschland's soldiers had been in continuous combat or movement for 72 hours. Men fell asleep during brief halts and had to be physically shaken awake when movement resumed. Tank crews operated their vehicles while half asleep, driving by instinct and muscle memory. The division's medical services were overwhelmed, treating not just combat casualties but exhaustion cases, men who simply collapsed from the cumulative stress. Manteuffel himself went 48 hours without sleep, moving constantly between his 3 combat groups, coordinating their movements, making instantaneous decisions about which units to commit and which to preserve. On July 20th, the division reached defensive positions on the East Prussian border and finally stopped retreating. They had preserved 70% of their combat strength, had saved perhaps 15,000 German soldiers from other shattered units who had attached themselves to Grossdeutschland's withdrawal and had delayed Soviet pursuit by perhaps 5 days. 5 days. In the grand strategic picture, Manteuffel's brilliant operation had purchased 5 days. Soviet forces continued advancing. By August, they would reach the Vistula River in Poland. By January 1945, they would be in Germany proper. No amount of tactical excellence could change these facts. Manteuffel knew this with perfect clarity. Yet he continued fighting, continued manoeuvring, continued finding ways to win local victories in a lost war. When asked years later why he did not seek a way out, why he continued serving a regime he knew was defeated, Manteuffel gave an answer that was both honest and inadequate. I was a soldier. My men depended on my decisions for their survival. How could I abandon them? The question of whether enabling their survival simply prolonged a criminal regime's existence, he never satisfactorily answered. July 20th, 1944. While Grossdeutschland established defensive positions in East Prussia, in the Wolf's Lair, barely 50 kilometers away, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb under the conference table during Hitler's daily military briefing. The bomb exploded at 12:42. 4 men died. Hitler survived with minor injuries. The assassination attempt, planned by a conspiracy of Wehrmacht officers who recognized that Germany's only hope was to end the war immediately, failed. In the purge that followed, over 7,000 people were arrested, nearly 5,000 executed. The Wehrmacht officer corps tore itself apart as loyalists denounced suspected conspirators. Manteuffel, commanding at the front, heard rumours but saw no evidence of the conspiracy. Whether he would have joined if approached remains unknowable. What is certain is that after July 20th, serving Hitler meant something darker than before. It was no longer possible to claim ignorance of alternatives. The officers who attempted the coup demonstrated that resistance was possible. Those who continued serving made a choice, and that choice carried moral weight. Manteuffel, brilliant tactician and pragmatic survivor, had made his choice. He would serve to the end. September 1, 1944, Grossdeutschland Division Headquarters, East Prussia. The message arrived by motorcycle courier, marked with the highest priority classification. Major General Hasso von Manteuffel was to report immediately to the Führerhauptquartier, the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia. No explanation, no indication of subject matter. Just the summons, which could mean anything from decoration to court-martial. Manteuffel handed command to his deputy and departed within the hour, travelling by staff car through devastated landscape. Soviet artillery had reached this far in their summer offensive, and evidence of the fighting marked every kilometre. Burned-out vehicles littered the roadsides. Villages stood empty. Civilian populations fled westward, ahead of the Red Army. The journey took 4 hours, and throughout Manteuffel contemplated what this summons might mean. His division had performed brilliantly, but brilliance was no guarantee of favour in Hitler's Reich. Competent generals who delivered unwelcome truths often found themselves relieved, or worse. The Wolf's Lair had changed since Manteuffel's last visit in January. Security was paranoid, multiple checkpoints with SS guards scrutinising documents and searching vehicles. The briefing compound bore visible damage from the July 20th bomb, one building still being reconstructed. The atmosphere was poisonous with suspicion. Officers avoided eye contact, spoke in hushed tones, acted as if walls had ears, which they probably did. Manteuffel was escorted to a waiting room and told the Führer would see him shortly. Shortly became 3 hours. Finally, an adjutant led him through heavily guarded corridors to the map room where Hitler conducted his daily situation conferences. The Führer stood hunched over maps of the Western Front, his left arm trembling slightly, a palsy that had worsened noticeably since January. When Hitler turned to face him, Manteuffel was shocked. The man had aged a decade in 8 months. Hitler's greeting was cordial, even warm. He congratulated Manteuffel on Grossdeutschland's performance, praised the Tegu Frumos battle specifically, called it a model of defensive excellence. Then, abruptly, Hitler's demeanour shifted. He asked Manteuffel for honest assessment of the Eastern Front situation. Could Army Group Centre be restored? Could the line in Poland hold through winter? Manteuffel, sensing a trap but committed to honesty, answered carefully, Army Group Centre no longer existed as a coherent force. The line in Poland could hold only if massive reinforcements arrived, which would require stripping troops from other fronts. The Red Army's material superiority was now so overwhelming that tactical skill could only delay, not prevent, further retreats. He expected Hitler to explode at this assessment. Instead, the Führer nodded slowly and said something that stunned Manteuffel into silence. Then, we must change the strategic situation in the West. What followed was 2 hours of military briefing, unlike anything Manteuffel had experienced. Hitler, his hands shaking over the maps, outlined a plan of breathtaking audacity and questionable sanity. Germany would launch a massive offensive in the West, through the Ardennes forest, splitting the American and British armies, driving to Antwerp to cut off Allied supplies, forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. This would free German forces to concentrate against the Soviets, restoring the Eastern Front. The operation would require 30 divisions, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, concentrating Germany's last mobile reserves in a single desperate gamble. Hitler spoke with messianic certainty, his voice growing stronger as he described the operation, his trembling hands moving across maps with sudden decisiveness. The Americans, he insisted, were militarily incompetent, politically divided, psychologically unprepared for serious casualties. A sharp blow would crack their coalition. Manteuffel listened with growing horror and fascination. The plan was operationally possible, but strategically delusional. Yes, German forces could achieve surprise in the Ardennes. Yes, the Americans had left this sector weakly defended. Yes, properly executed, the offensive might reach the Meuse River, perhaps even beyond. But Antwerp was 125 miles from the German start line, through difficult terrain, in winter weather, against an enemy with total air superiority and unlimited logistics. Even if German forces reached Antwerp, they could not hold it. The Americans would not negotiate, they would counterattack with overwhelming force. Meanwhile, the Soviets would certainly exploit Germany's commitment in the West to launch their own offensive in the East. The operation would destroy Germany's last mobile reserves and achieve nothing strategic. Yet, Manteuffel said none of this. Not because he lacked courage, but because he recognized that Hitler had already decided. This was not a planning session seeking input. It was a briefing where Hitler was explaining what would happen. Arguments would achieve nothing except potentially removing Manteuffel from participation. And if this operation was happening regardless, Manteuffel wanted to be involved because his tactical skill might at least minimize the disaster. So instead of objecting to the strategic concept, he objected to tactical details. The offensive plan called for preliminary artillery bombardment before the assault. Manteuffel argued this would sacrifice surprise. Better to infiltrate infantry forward in darkness, let them suppress American positions silently, then commit armor at first light. Hitler, surprisingly, listened. The Führer had summoned Manteuffel not just to brief him, but to refine the plan using the tactical expertise of successful commanders. September 16th, 1944. Hitler unveiled the full operation to select commanders. The meeting included Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Field Marshal Walter Model, SS General Sepp Dietrich, and Manteuffel. The objective: split the Allied armies by driving to Antwerp. The concept: 3 armies attacking on narrow fronts through the Ardennes, achieving breakthrough by surprise and mass, exploiting with mobile forces before Allies could respond. 6th SS Panzer Army under Dietrich would make the main effort in the north, driving for Liège and then Antwerp. 5th Panzer Army, Manteuffel's new command, would attack in the centre, crossing the Au River, capturing the critical road junction at Bastogne, continuing west to the Meuse. 7th Army would protect the southern flank. The timeline: attack in early December when winter weather would ground Allied aircraft. The promotion was extraordinary and ominous simultaneously. Manteuffel would command an entire panzer army, leapfrogging over dozens of more senior generals. He was 47 years old, one of the youngest army commanders in German military history. The opportunity represented Hitler's recognition of tactical excellence over political reliability. Manteuffel was neither a Nazi nor a member of Hitler's inner circle, simply a competent professional. But the opportunity also meant responsibility for an offensive Manteuffel believed was strategically futile. He would plan meticulously, execute brilliantly, and likely accomplish nothing except getting thousands of men killed. Yet he accepted without hesitation, because refusal meant replacement by someone less competent who would get even more men killed. The following 6 weeks became a frenzy of preparation. Manteuffel travelled to depots across Germany, selecting units for his army. He chose not just for current strength, but for leadership quality divisions commanded by aggressive, flexible officers who could improvise when plans collapsed. He inspected equipment, obsessively rejecting tanks with mechanical defects, demanding spare parts be stockpiled beyond regulation levels, organising repair companies for inevitable breakdowns. Most critically, he studied the terrain. The Ardennes was not ideal tank country, heavily forested, crossed by rivers and steep ridges, road network limited. This meant movement would be channeled, traffic jams likely, supply vulnerable. Manteuffel modified the operational plan to account for these constraints, organising his assault to seize specific road networks in sequence rather than attempting broad front advance. The fuel situation was catastrophic. 5th Panzer Army needed 5 million gallons of fuel to reach its objectives. Germany had reserves for 3 million gallons, enough to reach the Meuse River if everything went perfectly. The remaining 2 million gallons would have to be captured from American supply dumps. This assumption that German forces would capture enough American fuel to continue their own offensive was so optimistic as to border on fantasy. Manteuffel raised this issue repeatedly with higher headquarters. He was told that special commando units would seize American fuel dumps intact, that surprise would prevent demolitions, that captured supplies would solve the problem. Manteuffel knew this was wishful thinking masquerading as planning, but he had no alternative except to prepare as if it might work. October 29th, 1944. The final briefing at the Wolf's Lair. Hitler reviewed the entire operation personally, speaking for 3 hours without notes, his memory for detail remarkable despite his physical deterioration. He specified objectives for each day of the offensive, allocated reserves, outlined deception plans to keep the Allies ignorant of the coming attack. Then he turned to the assembled commanders and asked each directly, could this operation succeed? Dietrich, the SS general, gave enthusiastic endorsement. Model, the field marshal, expressed reservations about logistics but said the attack could reach the Meuse. Manteuffel, when his turn came, chose his words carefully. He said 5th Panzer Army would break through, would advance as far as fuel allowed, would accomplish every tactical objective within its power. He did not say the strategic objective was achievable. Hitler either did not notice the qualification or chose to ignore it. Leaving the Wolf's Lair for the last time, Manteuffel experienced contradictory emotions. Pride at the command, the opportunity to lead an army-sized operation, the chance to apply everything he had learned in 5 years of war. Dread at what he was being asked to do, the certainty that this offensive would consume Germany's last mobile reserves and achieve nothing strategic. Professional determination to execute his mission as brilliantly as possible, regardless of its ultimate futility. And underneath everything, a question he could not answer, was continuing to serve Hitler at this point, when defeat was mathematically certain, a professional necessity or a moral failure? Manteuffel, schooled in Prussian traditions of duty and obedience, could not resolve this question. So he did what Prussian officers had done for generations. He followed his orders and prepared to do his duty, letting history judge whether that duty constituted honour or complicity. December 16, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The darkness shattered. 2,000 German artillery pieces, assembled in secrecy over 6 weeks, opened fire simultaneously along an 85-kilometre front. The sound was beyond hearing, a physical pressure that crushed the air and shook the frozen ground. American forward positions, held by soldiers who had expected a quiet sector, disappeared under hurricane bombardment. For 30 minutes, German gunners poured shells into the American lines, high explosive, incendiary smoke, creating chaos and severing communications. Then, precisely at 600 hours, the barrage lifted and rolled forward, and behind it came the infantry. But not as American doctrine expected, not at dawn with tanks leading. Hasso von Manteuffel had modified the German attack plan one final time, and that modification would determine the opening day's success. In the command post of 5th Panzer Army, Manteuffel monitored the assault's progress by radio reports that came in fragmentary bursts. His divisions were attacking in darkness, infantry infiltrating forward without preliminary reconnaissance, locating American positions by sound and the flash of defensive fire. This violated standard German doctrine, which called for reconnaissance before assault, daylight for tanks, preparation before execution. But Manteuffel had recognized that American anti-tank defenses were the critical threat. Their 57mm guns and bazookas could destroy German tanks if they had visibility and time to aim. Send tanks forward at dawn, and they would be silhouetted against the brightening sky. Perfect targets. Send infantry first in darkness. Let them suppress American positions before the defenders were fully awake. Then commit armor after resistance was broken. The radio reports suggested this gamble was working. The assault divisions were reporting breakthrough, American units falling back in confusion, German infantry already across the Our River in multiple places. By 10:30 in the morning, the situation reports confirmed what Manteuffel had hoped: total surprise. The American 8th Corps, holding the Ardennes sector with 4 divisions stretched across 90 kilometers, had no idea this offensive was coming. German deception had been perfect. Radio silence maintained for weeks, movement conducted only at night, assault divisions moved into position 48 hours before the attack, too little time for American intelligence to detect the build-up. The weather, heavy fog and low clouds, had grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft for 4 days. American commanders had believed the Ardennes was a quiet sector where green divisions could gain experience and exhausted divisions could rest. Now those divisions were being hit by overwhelming force at multiple points simultaneously, and American response was paralysed by severed communications and lack of information. The 2nd Panzer Division, 5th Panzer Army's northern spearhead, achieved the day's most dramatic success. By midday, its lead elements had crossed the Klurf River, punched through the American 28th Infantry Division's positions, and were racing west on open roads. This was the breakthrough Manteuffel had sought: panzer forces in the American rear with clear routes westward. The division commander reported American resistance crumbling, roads clogged with retreating vehicles, total confusion in the American rear areas. The breakthrough had been achieved in 6 hours. Now came exploitation, the phase where German mobile doctrine promised decisive results. But even in this moment of tactical triumph, the operation's fundamental problems were emerging. Traffic jams developed almost immediately. The Ardennes road network was simply inadequate for moving 3 German armies simultaneously. Routes that looked acceptable on maps proved narrow and winding in reality, barely wide enough for tanks to pass. When vehicles broke down, they blocked entire columns. Villages became choke points, where traffic backed up for kilometres. Manteuffel's carefully planned movement schedules, which assumed average speeds of 20 kilometres per hour, were proving optimistic. Actual speeds were closer to 10 kilometres per hour, half what was needed to maintain momentum. American engineers, retreating but not panicking, demolished bridges and cratered roads. Each obstacle cost time while German engineers cleared it, time that allowed American reserves to move toward the breakthrough. The Baston problem emerged by late afternoon of the first day. Intelligence reports indicated American reinforcements were moving toward this small Belgian town, a road junction that controlled 7 paved highways. Manteuffel's operational plan assumed Baston would fall quickly, seized by advance elements before the Americans could organise defence. But the town had not fallen. American paratroopers, the 101st Airborne Division, were arriving by truck convoy, moving with impressive speed to reinforce the garrison. By evening, Baston was becoming a fortified position rather than an open objective. Manteuffel faced the fundamental dilemma of all breakthrough operations: stop to reduce the strongpoint and lose momentum, or bypass it and risk having a fortified position across your supply lines. December 17th, the second day, brought confirmation of both success and complications. 5th Panzer Army had penetrated 30 kilometres into American positions, the deepest advance. American units were retreating but beginning to organise coherent resistance. The Wehrmacht's momentum was still strong, but the explosive breakthrough was hardening into a battle of movement, attacker versus defender, both trying to establish favourable positions. Most critically, American air power remained grounded by weather. The fog and clouds that had enabled German surprise continued, preventing the Allied air forces from intervening. This weather was gift and curse simultaneously. It protected German movements from air attack, but also slowed those movements by reducing visibility and making roads more treacherous. Manteuffel made his decision regarding Bastogne on December 18th. 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division would bypass the town, continue westward toward the Meuse River. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division would encircle Bastogne and secure it with minimal forces. This decision was operationally correct according to Blitzkrieg. Doctrine: maintain momentum, don't get fixed fighting secondary objectives. But it was also strategically wrong because it underestimated Bastogne's importance. The town controlled the road network. Bypassing it meant German supply columns would have to detour along forest tracks. More critically, American forces holding Bastogne could raid German supply lines, disrupt reinforcement movements, generally create complications out of proportion to their numbers. Manteuffel recognised this risk but calculated that speed to the Meuse mattered more. By December 19th, the offensive's ambitious timeline was already slipping despite tactical success. 5th Panzer Army's lead elements were 50 kilometres from their start line, halfway to the Meuse, having covered in 3 days terrain that the plan assumed would take 1 day. The American resistance, initially shattered, was coalescing. American engineers were demolishing bridges faster than German engineers could replace them. American artillery, retreating but still coordinated, was inflicting casualties on exposed German columns. Most ominously, fuel consumption was exceeding projections. The narrow roads forced vehicles to run engines at high RPMs, burning fuel faster than anticipated. Several panzer divisions reported fuel stocks at 50%, critically low for units that were only halfway to their objectives. December 23rd brought the disaster Manteuffel had known was inevitable but hoped might be delayed. The weather cleared. For the first time in a week, the sky was blue and cloudless. American and British aircraft took off from bases in France, Belgium, and Britain. Fighters, fighter bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, over 15,000 sorties in 48 hours. German columns, moving in daylight on open roads because there was no alternative, became shooting galleries. American P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons, each carrying bombs and rockets, systematically worked over every German vehicle they could find. The Luftwaffe, with barely 200 operational fighters in the West, was simply overwhelmed. German anti-aircraft defences, understaffed and undersupplied, could not protect the long vehicle columns. By December 24th, Christmas Eve, Manteufel's reconnaissance reported that 2nd Panzer Division's lead elements had reached Selles, Belgium, within sight of the Meuse River, 4 miles from the Meuse, 60 miles from Antwerp, and completely out of fuel, immobilised within sight of their objective, surrounded by American forces, being systematically destroyed from the air and ground simultaneously. The high water mark of Hitler's last offensive, December 19, 1944, 500 hours. 5th Panzer Army Headquarters, Luxembourg. Hasso von Manteuffel studied the map in his mobile command post. The acetate overlay, marked with unit positions, updated hourly, showing a situation that looked successful and felt precarious simultaneously. His army had punched a 60-kilometre wide, 30-kilometre deep salient into American lines. The breakthrough had been achieved. Exploitation was underway. American forces were retreating. By every tactical measure, 5th Panzer Army was winning. But the blue circle around Bastogne on that map represented a problem that Manteuffel's operational instincts said was growing from nuisance to crisis. The morning intelligence briefing confirmed what he had feared. The American 101st Airborne Division had successfully occupied Bastogne in strength, transforming a road junction into a fortified position. The paratroopers had arrived with their organic artillery, engineers, and most critically, morale and training that exceeded the regular infantry divisions 5th Panzer Army had faced so far. The mathematics of the situation were brutal. Bastogne controlled 7 paved roads, radiating outward like spokes. Every other route through the Ardennes was either a dirt track that winter weather had turned to mud, or a forest trail barely passable for jeeps, much less supply trucks and tanks. 2nd Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division, the spearheads driving west toward the Meuse, depended on a single supply route that ran within artillery range of Bastogne. 26th Volksgrenadier Division, ordered to contain Bastogne with minimal forces, reported the American perimeter was strengthening hourly, with paratroopers digging in, positioning anti-tank guns, registering artillery fires on likely approach routes. To capture Bastogne would require committing significant forces Manteuffel needed for the westward drive. To bypass it, as he had ordered, meant accepting that American forces controlled critical terrain across his supply lines. Manteuffel made his decision based on German operational doctrine refined over 5 years of war. Maintain momentum, accept risk to the flanks, trust that speed would create opportunities to address problems later. The spearhead divisions would continue west. The siege of Bastogne would continue with minimal forces, enough to contain but not assault. This calculation assumed German forces would reach the Meuse quickly, would capture American supply dumps including fuel, would create a new operational situation that would make Bastogne's eventual fall inevitable. It was logical, consistent with Blitzkrieg principles, and ultimately catastrophic because it misunderstood both American resilience and the changing operational tempo of modern war. December 20th brought the first German ultimatum to Bastogne's defenders. 2 German officers approached American lines under flag of truce, carrying a formal surrender demand. The document, composed in proper diplomatic language, noted that Bastogne was surrounded, that further resistance was pointless, that continued defence would result only in unnecessary casualties. It offered honourable surrender terms. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the 101st Airborne's acting commander, sent back a reply that entered military legend, nuts. The single word, colloquial and defiant, captured American determination. The German officers, confused by the slang, required explanation. It meant no in emphatic vernacular. The Americans would not surrender, they would fight. Manteuffel never saw McAuliffe's famous reply. By December 20th, he was 200 kilometers west at a forward command post, focused entirely on pushing 2nd Panzer Division toward the Meuse. The siege of Bastogne had become someone else's problem, assigned to subordinate commanders, while Manteuffel concentrated on exploitation. This was proper command focus. Army commanders lead at the decisive point, delegate secondary missions. But it also meant Manteuffel had diminishing awareness of how Bastogne was evolving from bypass strongpoint into fulcrum, around which the entire offensive would turn. American commanders with clearer strategic vision than their German counterparts recognized Bastogne's importance immediately. Reinforcements flowed toward the town. Artillery batteries registered on the roads German supply columns had to use. Most critically, George Patton's 3rd Army, positioned to 5th Panzer Army's south, began preparing a counterattack to relieve Bastogne, pivoting 90 degrees north in an operational maneuver of staggering complexity. December 22nd, the weather's continued cooperation with German operations ended American paralysis. The heavy snow and fog that had grounded Allied aircraft since the offensive began finally lifted. Blue skies appeared, and with them came aerial vengeance. American C-47 transport aircraft, the reliable Dakotas that had dropped paratroopers over Normandy 6 months earlier, flew supply missions to Bastogne, delivering ammunition, medicine, and anti-tank weapons to the encircled defenders. Fighter bombers escorted the transports, then turned their attention to German forces surrounding the town. Manteuffel's supply columns forced a detour along forest roads because direct routes were within American artillery range of Bastogne, became targets. Each destroyed truck meant supplies not reaching the spearheads. Each burned fuel tanker meant panzers immobilized. The fuel crisis reached catastrophic levels on December 23rd. 2nd Panzer Division reported its lead battalion, the spearhead that had driven deepest into American territory, was completely immobilized 4 miles from the Meuse River. 0 fuel remaining. Attempts to airlift fuel forward had failed. The Luftwaffe simply lacked transport capacity. Ground resupply was impossible because American forces were cutting the division's supply route. British armoured forces, the 29th Armoured Brigade, were approaching from the west. American forces, 2nd Armoured Division, were closing from the north. 2nd Panzer's forward elements, those tanks, that had driven deepest and achieved most, were becoming an isolated pocket rather than a breakthrough force. Over 3 days, December 24th through 26th, those forward elements, were systematically destroyed. 82 tanks and assault guns lost, 2,500 men killed, wounded, or captured. The offensive's tip had been broken off. Christmas Day, December 25, 1944. Manteuffel spent the holiest day of the Christian calendar in a freezing command post, receiving reports of disaster. 2nd Panzer Division's forward elements were being annihilated. Panzer Air Division had also outrun its fuel supply and was immobilized. American resistance everywhere was stiffening rather than collapsing. Most ominously, Patton's Third Army had broken through German defences south of Bastogne and was advancing toward the encircled town. The American relief effort was succeeding, the German offensive was failing. The mathematical certainty was undeniable. 5th Panzer Army had achieved tactical breakthrough, had penetrated 65 miles in 9 days, had demonstrated once again German operational excellence, but it had not reached Antwerp, had not captured significant American supplies, had not split the Allied coalition. The strategic objective remained 60 miles away and mathematically unreachable. December 26 brought both the symbolic end of German hopes and confirmation of Manteuffel's growing despair. Patton's forces, moving with speed that impressed even German observers, broke through to Bastogne, linking up with the 101st Airborne. The siege was lifted. The road junction that Manteuffel had bypassed, calculating that speed mattered more than thoroughness, remained in American hands and now served as the anchor for American counterattacks. Hitler, receiving reports of Patton's breakthrough, ordered renewed attacks on Bastogne, throwing reserves into assaults aimed at re-establishing encirclement. Manteuffel, reading these orders at his command post, recognized their futility. The offensive's momentum had died. American reserves were arriving faster than German units could advance. The weather, which had been Germany's ally for the first week, was now Germany's enemy, with clear skies allowing American air power to dominate. The decision Manteuffel made on December 28th, bypassing Bastogne to maintain momentum, had been tactically correct but operationally insufficient. Blitzkrieg doctrine preached maintaining tempo, bypassing strong points, trusting that speed would create opportunities. This doctrine had worked in Poland when the campaign lasted 5 weeks. It had worked in France when the campaign lasted 6 weeks. It was failing in the Ardennes because modern warfare had evolved beyond what Blitzkrieg could accomplish. American logistics could move reinforcements faster than German armour could exploit breakthroughs. American communications could coordinate responses faster than German attacks could create chaos. American material superiority could replace losses faster than German forces could inflict them. Manteuffel, brilliant tactician, had executed his mission with skill that would be studied in military academies for decades. But tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic impossibility. The Bastogne decision, bypass or reduce, had not determined the offensive's failure. The offensive had been doomed from inception by mathematics that no amount of operational excellence could change. December 24, 1944, dawn, Celles, Belgium. Hasso von Manteuffel stood beside his staff car, binoculars pressed to his eyes, staring across the frozen Belgian countryside toward a line of trees 3 kilometers distant. Beyond those trees flowed the Meuse River. The operational objective that Hitler's plan had said must be reached by December 19th, 5 days ago. Now, on Christmas Eve morning, German forces had finally reached visual range of the Meuse. 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance elements occupied the village of Celles. Their vehicles concealed in barns and beneath camouflage netting, their crews exhausted and nearly out of ammunition. They had covered 65 miles in 8 days, punching through American defences, bypassing strong points, maintaining momentum against increasing resistance. 4 miles separated them from the Meuse. 4 miles? And they might as well have been 400. The division's fuel tanks were empty. Supply columns that should have followed the advance had been destroyed by American air attacks or were stuck in traffic jams 50 kilometres back. The spearhead, having achieved its tactical objective, was immobilised at the moment of success. The scene around Celles revealed the offensive's collapse in miniature. German tanks and half-tracks sat in fields, their crews standing beside them rather than inside them, conserving what little fuel remained for heaters because the alternative was freezing to death. Ammunition stocks had been reduced to basic loads, enough for one engagement, perhaps two. Food supplies were whatever could be scavenged from Belgian farms, the Wehrmacht's logistics system having prioritised fuel and ammunition over rations. Most critically, the tactical initiative had shifted. 2nd Panzer Division was no longer attacking but defending, no longer exploiting but surviving. American forces were closing from multiple directions. British tanks were reported approaching from the west. American infantry from the north. Patton's army from the south. The pincer was closing, and 2nd Panzer was caught in its jaws. Manteuffel's visit to Celles on Christmas Eve was both reconnaissance and farewell. He needed to see personally whether the division could be saved, whether one final push might reach the Meuse despite fuel shortages. The division commander, Colonel Meinrad von Lauschet, gave him the mathematics without embellishment. 180 tanks and assault guns had started the offensive. 80 remained operational. Of those 80, perhaps 30 had enough fuel for combat manoeuvres. 0 fuel reserves existed for exploitation beyond current positions. American forces surrounding the division outnumbered German forces 3-1 and were receiving constant reinforcement. Air superiority was total. Allied fighter bombers owned the sky, attacking anything that moved during daylight hours. The conclusion was inevitable. 2nd Panzer Division, the 5th Panzer Army's spearhead, the unit that had driven deepest into American lines, was finished as an offensive force. The decision to attempt breakout came not from Manteuffel but from Hitler, transmitted through multiple layers of command, each layer adding its own interpretation and urgency. The Führer, receiving reports that German forces were within sight of the Meuse, insisted that one final push would achieve breakthrough. Reinforcements would be sent, fuel would be airdropped. The offensive must continue. These orders reflected Hitler's deteriorating grasp of battlefield reality, his belief that willpower could overcome material constraints. Manteuffel, reading the orders in his command vehicle, recognized their impossibility. No reinforcements existed within range to affect the situation. Fuel airdrops required transport aircraft the Luftwaffe no longer possessed in operational numbers. The offensive was finished, but admitting this to Hitler meant being relieved of command or worse. So Manteuffel did what Wehrmacht generals had learned to do. He transmitted the orders to his subordinates, knowing they would attempt the impossible, hoping they would survive their inevitable failure. Christmas Day, 1944. While families across the Christian world celebrated the holiday, the Battle of Celles reached its climax. American forces, the 2nd Armoured Division reinforced, with British tanks and tank destroyers, launched coordinated attacks from 3 directions. German forces, low on ammunition and fuel, fought with the desperation of men who knew they were dying for nothing. The battle lasted 8 hours and ended German offensive capability in the Ardennes permanently. Over 80 German tanks and assault guns were destroyed, their burning hulks marking the furthest extent of Hitler's last gamble. 2,500 German soldiers became casualties, killed or wounded or captured. The survivors, those who managed to break out and retreat eastward, were fragments of the once elite division, traumatized men straggling back toward German lines with stories of annihilation. Manteuffel received the casualty reports on December 26th at his headquarters in Wiltz, Luxembourg. The numbers were catastrophic, but somehow expected. 2nd Panzer Division was combat ineffective, requiring months to rebuild. Panzer Lehr Division, which had also advanced deep into American lines, was similarly shattered. 9th Panzer Division, held in reserve, had been committed piecemeal and chewed up without achieving any breakthrough. 5th Panzer Army, which 10 days earlier had numbered over 100,000 men and 400 tanks, had lost approximately 25,000 casualties and 250 armoured vehicles. The American forces opposing 5th Panzer Army had suffered heavily too, but American losses were being replaced while German losses were irreplaceable. The mathematics of industrial warfare were reasserting themselves after 10 days when German tactical skill had seemed sufficient to overcome material disadvantages. The Meuse River remained German territory on maps, but existed in American hands in reality. Not a single German soldier crossed that river in strength during the entire offensive. The closest approach, Schellers, had ended in disaster. Other spearheads had been stopped even shorter of their objectives. 6th SS Panzer Army, assigned the main effort in the northern sector, had failed spectacularly. Its advance measured in single-digit kilometres despite having more resources than Manteuffel's army. The entire operational concept breakthrough exploitation race to Antwerp had collapsed not through lack of German courage or tactical skill, but through the iron logic of modern warfare's mathematics. Germany could not move supplies forward faster than America could move reinforcements. Germany could not replace losses faster than they were being inflicted. Germany could not sustain offensive operations when enemy air power owned the sky. The meetings between Manteuffel and his superiors during late December were exercises in shared delusion and private despair. Field Marshal Model, commanding Army Group B, acknowledged privately that the offensive had failed, but insisted publicly that operational success remained possible. Hitler, receiving briefings at his headquarters, refused to authorize withdrawal despite the obviously deteriorating situation. Instead, the Führer ordered renewed attacks, demanded that forces push toward the Meuse despite lacking fuel or ammunition or replacements. These orders created impossible situations for commanders at every level. Manteuffel had to transmit orders he knew were unexecutable, watch his subordinates attempt the impossible, count casualties that accomplished nothing. The cognitive dissonance was maddening, continuing to fight brilliantly for objectives everyone knew were unattainable. December 28th brought Manteuffel's most difficult decision of the offensive. Intelligence reports indicated American forces were preparing major counterattacks from both north and south. Pincer movements designed to cut off German forces in the salient and create encirclements. The logical response was immediate withdrawal to defensible lines, preserving forces while terrain still permitted organised retreat. But Hitler had forbidden withdrawals. Any commander who retreated without explicit permission faced court-martial. Manteuffel drafted a request for permission to conduct tactical adjustments, military euphemism for retreat, and sent it through channels knowing it would be denied. The response came within hours. Hold present positions, continue attacking. Victory depended on willpower. Manteuffel read this message and understood that 5th Panzer Army would be ground down in pointless defence of indefensible positions because the Supreme Commander refused to acknowledge reality. The view from Celis, looking across those final 4 miles toward the Meuse River, had been Manteuffel's moment of clarity. He had executed his mission with skill that future military historians would praise. 5th Panzer Army had achieved the Ardennes offensive's deepest penetration, had demonstrated tactical excellence against increasing odds, had validated every principle of mobile warfare except the principle that mattered most. Operations require logistics, and logistics require resources Germany no longer possessed. Standing there on Christmas Eve, watching his best division die within sight of its objective, Manteuffel finally accepted what he had known intellectually since September, but had refused to acknowledge emotionally. Germany had lost the war. Everything from this point forward was merely determining how many more would die before the inevitable end. His duty as a commander was clear: minimize those deaths while continuing to resist. Preserve his soldiers' lives while serving a regime whose orders increasingly guaranteed their destruction. The contradiction was irresolvable, and it would haunt Manteuffel for the rest of his life. January 3, 1945, Ardennes salient, Belgium. The Americans attacked from north and south simultaneously, 1 million men and 3,000 tanks moving to eliminate the bulge that German forces had driven into Allied lines. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army from a headquarters that relocated daily to avoid American artillery, watched the operational maps with grim recognition. This was exactly what had happened to Soviet forces in the war's early years: penetrate deep, get surrounded, die piecemeal. Now, Germany was experiencing the same treatment, the same methodical reduction of exposed salients, the same mathematics where defender casualties exceeded attacker casualties, but attacker could replace losses and defender could not. The American First Army attacked from the north, pushing through the Ardennes forests with grinding persistence. Patton's Third Army attacked from the south with characteristic aggression. The 2 American forces were aiming to meet at Houffalize, a Belgian town whose only significance was geographic if Americans controlled Houffalize. German forces west of that point would be trapped. Hitler's response to the Allied counteroffensive was predictable and disastrous. He ordered continued attacks westward, insisted the Meuse remained achievable, forbade any withdrawals. These orders arrived at Manteuffel's headquarters with numbing regularity, each one more detached from battlefield reality than the last. 5th Panzer Army no longer possessed offensive capability. Its divisions were combat ineffective, their strength reduced by casualties and mechanical breakdowns to fractions of authorized levels. Fuel shortages meant tanks remained immobile more often than they moved. Ammunition rationing limited artillery support to critical defensive fires only. Air superiority belonged entirely to the Americans, who flew close support missions whenever weather permitted, destroying German vehicles and killing German soldiers with impunity. Continuing to attack under these conditions was not military strategy but suicide. Manteuffel's solution was creative interpretation of orders, the Wehrmacht equivalent of malicious compliance. Hitler ordered attacks. Manteuffel organized local counterattacks against American penetrations, calling them offensive operations in reports, while actually fighting pure defense. Hitler forbade withdrawals. Manteuffel conducted tactical adjustments and line straightening, military euphemisms that allowed backward movement without technically violating orders. This required careful bureaucratic management, ensuring that reports sent to higher headquarters described operations in language Hitler wanted to hear, while actual orders to subordinate units reflected battlefield reality. The deception was necessary for survival, both Manteuffel's personal survival as commander and his soldiers' survival as a fighting force. January 8 brought grudging permission from Hitler to begin withdrawing from the Ardennes salient. The authorization came 10 days too late, after American forces had closed to within kilometers of Hauffeleis, after German casualties had mounted unnecessarily, after equipment that could have been saved had been destroyed. The withdrawal order specified that forces would retreat to the West Wall, the Siegfried Line fortifications along Germany's pre-war border. This represented abandoning every metre of territory gained in the December offensive, returning to start positions after suffering catastrophic losses. The operational result was zero. The casualties were permanent. Germany had gambled its last mobile reserves and lost everything. The fighting withdrawal from the Ardennes demonstrated Manteuffel's defensive mastery and the Wehrmacht's institutional competence even in collapse. 5th Panzer Army organised rear guards that defended successive positions for 24 to 48 hours before withdrawing, imposing delay and casualties on American pursuers. Engineers demolished bridges systematically, mined roads, created obstacles that forced Americans to halt and deploy. Artillery concentrated fires on American advance units, inflicting disproportionate casualties during each withdrawal phase. The retreat was orderly rather than rout, controlled rather than panic. By January 16th, when American forces from north and south met at Hauffeleis, most of 5th Panzer Army had escaped encirclement. The professional execution was impressive. The strategic situation remained catastrophic. January 23, 1945. 5th Panzer Army completed its withdrawal behind the West Wall, occupying fortifications built in the 1930s to protect Germany's western frontier. Manteuffel conducted his assessment of the Ardennes campaign with brutal honesty that would never appear in official reports. The offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, missing. Tank losses exceeded 800 vehicles, effectively the entire operational reserve. Artillery losses topped 600 guns. Vehicle losses exceeded 10,000 trucks and half-tracks. The Luftwaffe had lost over 300 aircraft in futile attempts to support ground operations against overwhelming Allied air superiority. In exchange for these losses, Germany had gained nothing. The Americans had been surprised and pushed back, but not defeated. Allied cooperation had been tested, but not broken. The strategic situation in the West was identical to December 15, except Germany was vastly weaker. The cost of the Ardennes offensive became clear when viewed in context of the Eastern Front situation. While Germany committed its last reserves to operations in Belgium, the Soviet Union completed preparations for winter offensives in Poland. On January 12, 4 days before the Ardennes Bulge was eliminated, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive with 2.2 million men and 6,000 tanks. German forces in Poland, stripped of reserves to feed the Ardennes offensive, collapsed. Within 2 weeks, Soviet forces advanced 500 kilometers, reaching the Oder River, barely 60 kilometers from Berlin. The tanks destroyed in Belgium could have delayed the Soviet advance. The casualties suffered in the Ardennes could have defended German territory. Hitler's strategic gamble had not only failed in the West, it had guaranteed catastrophe in the East. Manteuffel's soldiers, those who survived the Ardennes, were changed men. The veterans of Poland and France had fought with confidence in German superiority and belief in victory. The veterans of Russia had fought with grim determination and hope that skill might overcome material disadvantage. The survivors of the Ardennes fought with nothing but professional competence and personal loyalty to their comrades. They knew Germany had lost the war. They knew continued resistance would only increase casualties without changing outcomes. Yet they continued fighting because they were soldiers in an army that still existed, because retreat was impossible when surrounded by enemies, because surrender to the Soviets meant likely death, and surrender to the Western Allies meant years in POW camps. The Wehrmacht of January 1945 was a zombie army, already dead, but still moving through institutional momentum. The operational lessons Manteuffel drew from the Ardennes campaign were clear, but ultimately irrelevant. First, surprise and tactical excellence could achieve initial success, but could not overcome sustained material inferiority. Second, mobile operations required logistics infrastructure Germany no longer possessed. Third, weather's role in modern warfare was decisive clear skies meant Allied air superiority negated German ground superiority. Fourth, American military competence was vastly better than Hitler acknowledged. American forces had recovered from surprise quickly, moved reserves rapidly, coordinated complex operations effectively. Fifth, Germany's strategic position was hopeless. The nation faced enemies with unlimited industrial capacity, unbreakable alliances, and absolute determination to achieve unconditional surrender. These lessons, accurate and operationally sound, made no difference because Germany's leadership rejected any conclusion that suggested negotiated peace or surrender. Manteuffel's personal assessment, recorded in his diary in cryptic language that avoided explicit defeatism, captured the profound despair of intelligent officers serving a doomed regime. He wrote, "We asked our soldiers to accomplish the impossible, and they nearly succeeded. Their courage deserved better leadership, better strategy, better purpose. History will judge whether continued service to a lost cause constituted duty or crime. I served because soldiers depend on commanders for their survival. I commanded to minimize their suffering, while orders demanded I maximize their sacrifice. The contradiction is unsustainable, the moral burden unbearable, the duty inescapable." These were the thoughts of a man who recognized his complicity, understood his helplessness, and continued serving because professional identity and personal ethics provided no alternative he could accept. The Ardennes offensive had failed. Worse, it had been doomed from inception. Worst of all, Manteuffel had known it would fail and participated anyway. The guilt of that knowledge would follow him for decades. February 8, 1945, Reichswald Forest, Germany. The thunder of 500,000 artillery shells falling in 5 hours announced the end of Germany as it had existed. Operation Veritable, the Canadian First Army's assault to clear the Rhineland, began with bombardment that exceeded anything the Western Front had witnessed. Hasso von Manteuffel, now commanding 5th Panzer Army in defensive positions along the Rhine's western approaches, listened to the barrage from his headquarters 30 kilometers away and understood immediately that this was different from previous Allied offensives. This was not probing attack or limited objective operation. This was the beginning of Germany's final destruction, the methodical elimination of German forces west of the Rhine preparatory to invasion of Germany proper. The psychological impact was crushing for 5 years. German armies had fought on foreign soil in Poland and France and Russia and North Africa. Now the war had come home. The operational situation facing Manteuffel in February 1945 was hopeless by any rational calculation. 5th Panzer Army numbered 75,000 men, down from 120,000 before the Ardennes offensive. Many were replacements, including 16-year-old boys and recovered wounded returned to service before fully healed. Equipment shortages were critical. Divisions authorised 100 tanks, operated with 30 artillery battalions, had ammunition for one major engagement. Infantry companies lacked machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Most critically, Manteuffel commanded 100 kilometres of front terrain that German doctrine said required 300,000 men to defend properly. He was expected to hold this front against Allied armies that outnumbered him 4-1, possessed total air superiority, and had unlimited logistics. The defensive strategy Manteuffel implemented reflected hard lessons from the Eastern Front. Since holding every position was impossible, he concentrated forces at critical points, road junctions, river crossings, high ground commanding approach routes. Between these strongpoints, he deployed screening forces, light infantry with instructions to delay rather than defend, impose casualties rather than hold ground, mobile reserves, the few Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units, still combat effective, positioned centrally to counterattack penetrations, artillery concentrated fires rather than distributing them evenly, massing guns to break up Allied attacks at decisive points. The defensive system was coherent and professional and grossly inadequate for the task. February 23rd brought Operation Grenade, the American 9th Army's assault across the Ruhr River directly into 5th Panzer Army sector. The Americans attacked with overwhelming material superiority, 300,000 men, 2,000 artillery pieces, close air support from thousands of fighter bombers. German defences, thinly stretched and under-resourced, held for 6 hours before breaking. By afternoon, American armour was across the Ruhr at multiple points, advancing east toward the Rhine. Manteuffel committed his mobile reserves, scraped together units that bore elite designations but were elite in name only. They counterattacked bravely and were destroyed methodically by American artillery and airstrikes. By February 25th, American forces had penetrated 40 kilometers, and 5th Panzer Army's coherence was dissolving. March 2, 1945, Manteuffel received orders that made military sense and political sense and moral sense, but would enrage. Withdraw all forces east of the Rhine, demolish all bridges, establish defensive line on the river's eastern bank. The order came from Field Marshal Kesselring, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief West, who possessed enough authority and credibility to override Hitler's standing orders to hold every metre of ground. Manteuffel executed the withdrawal with relief. His army had been fighting delaying actions for 3 weeks, bleeding strength daily, accomplishing nothing except dying slowly. Retreat across the Rhine at least offered possibility of establishing defensible positions. The withdrawal became chaos when Hitler intervened personally. The Führer, receiving reports that German forces were abandoning the Rhineland without fighting to the last man, countermanded Kesselring's orders and demanded renewed defence west of the Rhine. These contradictory orders, Kesselring saying withdraw, Hitler saying hold, created paralysis at every command level. Units received orders to retreat, began withdrawing, then received orders to hold present positions, attempted to reverse movement while under American pressure. The resulting confusion cost thousands of unnecessary casualties as units were caught during movement, destroyed by American forces exploiting German disorganization. March 7, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, one of the few Rhine bridges still standing, was captured intact by American forces of the 9th Armored Division. German engineers had prepared demolitions but failed to destroy the bridge before Americans crossed. Within hours, American forces established a bridgehead on the Rhine's eastern bank, the first Allied forces on German territory west of the Rhine. The operational implications were devastating. Germany's Rhine defensive line had been breached before it was fully established. American forces had secured a crossing point that would allow unlimited reinforcement. The strategic defense of Western Germany, the last geographical barrier protecting the industrial Ruhr, had been compromised at inception. Manteuffel's final meeting with Hitler occurred March 15 in Berlin, a surreal encounter in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The bunker was command post and tomb simultaneously, concrete walls vibrating from Soviet artillery strikes falling on Berlin's outskirts, staff officers moving through dim corridors like ghosts, maps showing situations everyone knew were hopeless. Hitler, now barely recognizable as the man who had stood astride Europe 5 years earlier, received Manteuffel with courtesy and delusion intermingled. He asked about the situation on the Rhine, listened to Manteuffel's report of Allied superiority and German weakness, then issued orders that bore no relation to reality. 5th Panzer Army would counterattack across the Rhine, eliminate the Remagen bridgehead, restore the defensive line. When Manteuffel explained that his army lacked fuel, ammunition, and combat strength for such operations, Hitler replied that willpower would compensate for material shortages. The meeting lasted 20 minutes and accomplished nothing except confirming that Germany's leadership had departed from rationality entirely. Leaving the Führer bunker, walking through ruined Berlin streets where buildings burned and civilians scavenged for food, Manteuffel experienced psychological fracture that would take years to process. He commanded an army engaged in military operations that everyone knew were futile, He served a regime whose orders bore no relationship to achievable objectives. He led men who trusted his tactical judgment while implementing strategic directives he knew were suicidal. The contradictions were unsustainable. Wehrmacht tradition demanded obedience to lawful orders. Military professionalism demanded honest assessment of tactical possibilities. Personal ethics demanded minimizing casualties. Hitler's orders demanded maximum sacrifice for unattainable objectives. Manteuffel had no resolution for these contradictions. So he did what he had done throughout the war. He returned to his command, transmitted Hitler's impossible orders in modified form that made them slightly less suicidal, and continued fighting battles he knew Germany would lose. The Rhineland campaign cost 5th Panzer Army another 30,000 casualties, losses that could not be replaced. American forces, meanwhile, continued building up their Remagen bridgehead, expanding it daily, preparing for the final offensive that would carry them into Germany's heart. The Rhine, which German propaganda had promised would be impregnable defensive barrier, had been crossed in the campaign's first week. The West Wall, the Siegfried Line fortifications that were supposed to delay Allied advances for months, had been bypassed or reduced in weeks. Every defensive line, every geographical barrier, every strategic assumption had failed. Germany's western frontier had collapsed not through lack of German courage, but through mathematics. Allied material superiority was so overwhelming that tactical skill made no difference. Manteuffel had fought brilliantly, his soldiers had died bravely, and none of it mattered. The war was entering its final phase, and that phase would be horror beyond what even the Eastern Front had inflicted. April 1, 1945. Ruhr Industrial Region, Germany. The trap closed with mechanical precision. American 1st Army advancing from the south, American 9th Army driving from the north, met at Lippstadt and sealed the encirclement. 325,000 German soldiers, including the entirety of 5th Panzer Army and 18 other divisions, were surrounded in the Ruhr industrial basin. The pocket measured roughly 70 kilometers east to west, 50 kilometers north to south, containing Germany's most important industrial region, and now containing Germany's last significant concentration of military power in the West. Hasso von Manteuffel, receiving reports of the encirclement at his headquarters in Duisburg, recognized this for what it was. Germany's Stalingrad, the Western Front's version of the catastrophe Germany had inflicted on Soviet forces and now suffered in return. The historical symmetry was bitter. 3 years earlier, German armies had surrounded Soviet forces and demanded surrender. Now American armies surrounded German forces and would accept nothing less than capitulation. Field Marshal Walter Model commanded Army Group B, the formation trapped in the Ruhr pocket. Model was 54 years old, a dedicated Nazi, Hitler's favourite defensive commander, the man who had stabilised countless crises on the Eastern Front through sheer tactical brilliance and iron will. He was also a realist who understood military mathematics. Model assembled his senior commanders on April 2nd to assess their situation. The mathematics were pitiless. 300,000 men in the pocket, no possibility of resupply, ammunition stocks sufficient for perhaps 10 days of intensive combat, food supplies for 2 weeks, American forces surrounding them, outnumbering them 2-1, with unlimited artillery and total air superiority. Model asked each commander, could the pocket be held? Could they break out? The answers varied in phrasing, but were unanimous in content. The pocket could not be held indefinitely. Breakout was theoretically possible, but would require abandoning wounded, destroying equipment, accepting catastrophic casualties among units attempting to fight through American lines. Manteuffel's assessment was characteristically blunt. 5th Panzer Army existed as organizational concept more than combat reality. His divisions had been ground down through 6 months of continuous operations: Ardennes offensive, Rhineland defence, fighting withdrawal. Personnel strength was perhaps 40% of authorised levels. Heavy equipment had been largely destroyed or abandoned. Fuel stocks were minimal. Ammunition sufficient for local defence only. Most critically, morale had collapsed. Soldiers understood the war was lost. Understood. Continued resistance, accomplished nothing except delaying inevitable surrender. Officers still enforced discipline, units still obeyed orders, but the fighting spirit that had characterized the Wehrmacht was gone. These were men waiting for permission to stop dying. Model's decision was to continue resistance, not from belief in victory, but from definition of duty as he understood it. He would not order mass surrender, would not give Hitler and the Nazi leadership excuse to claim Army Group B had betrayed Germany. Units would fight until overwhelmed, commanders would make individual decisions about capitulation, the Army Group would die piecemeal rather than surrender wholesale. This decision reflected Model's personal code: better death than dishonour, better destruction than capitulation. Manteuffel found this logic simultaneously honourable and horrifying. Honourable because it reflected genuine values about military duty. Horrifying because it guaranteed thousands more deaths for no operational benefit. April 8th, 1945. The Ruhr pocket split in two as American forces punched through the centre, dividing Army Group B's northern and southern elements. Model's headquarters was now in the southern pocket, cut off from direct communication with northern units including portions of 5th Panzer Army. The fragmentation accelerated collapse. Individual divisions, surrounded and without orders, began surrendering. Manteuffel, in the northern pocket, maintained coordination of his scattered units, but recognised the situation was terminal. His soldiers were fighting without supplies, without hope, without purpose, beyond following orders from commanders who themselves questioned the order's utility. April 12 brought news that briefly insanely revived German hopes. American President Franklin Roosevelt had died. Hitler, receiving this news in the Berlin bunker, proclaimed it the miracle of Brandenburg, a reference to Frederick the Great's salvation when Russian Empress Elizabeth died in 1762, causing Russia to withdraw from the 7 Years' War. Hitler insisted Roosevelt's death would fracture the Allied coalition, would lead to American-Soviet split, would create opportunity for Germany to negotiate separate peace with the West. Model, hearing this proclamation via radio message, reportedly laughed bitterly. Vice President Truman would continue Roosevelt's policies. The Allied coalition was united by shared determination to achieve Germany's unconditional surrender. Roosevelt's death changed nothing strategically. But the hope, however delusional, demonstrated how desperate Germany's situation had become when leadership celebrated enemy president's death as potential salvation. April 15, 1945. Model issued his final orders to Manteuffel. Continue resistance as long as possible. Prevent American forces from shifting troops to other fronts. Accept that relief was impossible. Then Model added something that violated every protocol. I am taking a walk from which I will not return. Manteuffel understood immediately. Model was going to commit suicide rather than surrender. The field marshal, devoted Nazi and brilliant tactician, could not accept survival when survival meant captivity and likely prosecution. On April 21st, Model walked into a forest near Duisburg, removed his pistol, and shot himself. He was buried in an unmarked grave by his staff, who then surrendered to American forces. The Army Group commander had chosen death. His soldiers would choose survival. Manteuffel faced his own decision in the Ruhr pocket's final days. He could continue fighting, ordering his units to resist until overrun, maximizing American casualties while guaranteeing German casualties. This was Model's path, honourable by traditional military codes. Or he could recognise reality. The war was lost, further resistance was pointless, his duty was to preserve his soldiers' lives rather than spend them for nothing. On April 17th, Manteuffel issued orders that carefully avoided the word surrender, but effectively ended 5th Panzer Army's resistance. Units were to cease offensive operations, establish defensive positions, engage American forces only if directly attacked, and accept capitulation when it became tactically necessary. Over 3 days, 5th Panzer Army dissolved as organised formation, its units surrendering company by company, battalion by battalion, until by April 21st, nothing remained but scattered groups waiting for Americans to arrive and disarm them. April 21st, 1945. Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding general of 5th Panzer Army, formally surrendered to elements of the American 8th Armoured Division near Wuppertal. The ceremony, if it could be called that, was brief and awkward. American officers, expecting proud German general to deliver ceremonial sword, found instead an exhausted man who spoke English and wanted primarily to ensure his remaining soldiers received food and medical care. Manteuffel had no sword to surrender. He carried only a pistol, which he handed over matter-of-factly. The Americans took his weapon, searched him for documents, and assigned MPs to guard him. Within hours, Manteuffel was in a processing centre where he learned the full extent of the Ruhr Pocket's collapse. Over 317,000 German soldiers had surrendered, the largest mass capitulation in Western Front history, exceeding even the final surrenders of 1945's last weeks. Army Group B had ceased to exist. 5th Panzer Army was destroyed. The war in the West was effectively over. The Ruhr Pocket's elimination freed 30 American divisions for operations elsewhere, troops that would pursue remnants of German forces eastward and meet Soviet armies in the heart of Germany. The operational impact was decisive. The industrial capacity of the Ruhr, which had sustained German war production, was now in Allied hands. The military forces that might have defended Germany's interior had been eliminated. Most importantly, the psychological impact on remaining German resistance was crushing. If Army Group B, Germany's strongest remaining formation in the West, had been surrounded and destroyed so easily, what chance did scattered remnants have? The answer was obvious: none. Manteuffel, sitting in an American POW cage, surrounded by thousands of German soldiers who looked at him with mixture of respect and accusation, faced that answer personally. He had commanded brilliantly, fought skillfully, obeyed orders faithfully, and now he was prisoner, his army destroyed, his nation collapsing. The question that would haunt him for years was already forming. Had his service prolonged suffering without changing outcomes? Had tactical excellence in service of strategic evil constituted complicity? He had no answers, only the certainty that history would judge, and that judgment would be harsh. May 8, 1945. POW, Camp Belgium. The war ended on a Tuesday. Hasso von Manteuffel, prisoner of war number 64731 in a Belgian detention facility, learned of Germany's unconditional surrender from American guards who seemed simultaneously relieved and anticlimactic about victory. VE Day, victory in Europe, meant parties and celebrations in London and New York and Paris. In the POW camp, it meant simply that the uncertainty was over. The pretense that German forces might still achieve something was abandoned. The future clarified as years of captivity followed by uncertain return to whatever remained of Germany. Manteuffel stood in a wire enclosure with 10,000 other German prisoners, watched guards distribute Red Cross parcels to celebrate the occasion, and processed what surrender meant. He had served in the military for 24 years. His entire adult life had been devoted to German armed forces. That identity, that purpose, had now been severed. He was no longer a general commanding armies, but a prisoner awaiting disposition. The first months of captivity were psychological adjustment as much as physical confinement. The POW camps were organised chaos, overwhelmed by hundreds of thousands of German prisoners arriving faster than processing could accommodate them. Manteuffel, as senior officer, found himself responsible for internal camp organisation, coordinating with American authorities for supplies, mediating disputes between prisoners, maintaining discipline among men who had no clear purpose beyond surviving until release. The work was mundane and necessary and utterly divorced from his previous existence. Where he had commanded tank divisions, he now organised latrine schedules. Where he had planned operations involving thousands of vehicles, he now negotiated with American captains for additional blankets. The psychological dislocation was profound. Summer 1945 brought the revelation that shattered what remained of Wehrmacht officers' self-conception. The concentration camps were liberated, their horrors photographed and documented. American forces had overrun Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Soviet forces had liberated Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the industrial-scale genocide that Nazi Germany had perpetrated while Wehrmacht soldiers fought for that same Germany, was revealed in full. American authorities showed the footage to German POWs, skeletal survivors, mass graves, gas chambers, crematoria. The stated purpose was denazification, forcing German military personnel to confront what their service had enabled. The actual impact varied. Some prisoners claimed ignorance, insisted they had known nothing of extermination camps, had fought cleanly. Others admitted they had known something was happening to Jews but had not imagined the scale. Others simply went silent. Manteuffel's response to the Holocaust's revelation was complex and inadequate simultaneously, He had not participated directly in genocide. Tank commanders did not administer death camps. He had fought on front lines distant from extermination centres. But this geographic and functional separation did not constitute moral innocence. The Wehrmacht had enabled Nazi Germany's existence. Every military victory had strengthened the regime that perpetrated genocide. Every day of continued resistance had allowed the extermination apparatus to function longer. Manteuffel wrote in a letter to his wife, somehow delivered through Red Cross channels, "I fought for Germany, not for this horror." But Germany and this horror were inseparable, and I did not ask questions I should have asked. It was acknowledgement without absolution, recognition without resolution. He could not claim he had resisted the regime, he had served it faithfully. He could not claim ignorance. Rumours of Jewish persecution had been widespread. He could only claim he had focused on his professional duties and ignored larger moral context, which was precisely the failure that made the Holocaust possible. September 1945. The interrogations began in earnest. American military intelligence, particularly the Historical Division, recognised that German officers possessed tactical and operational knowledge valuable for future military planning. Manteuffel was particularly valuable. He had commanded at division, corps, and army level, had fought on eastern and western fronts, had participated in every major German offensive from Poland through the Ardennes. His tactical insights could inform American doctrine. His observations about Soviet operations could support Cold War planning already, beginning as Allied-Soviet cooperation fractured. Over 6 months, Manteuffel gave over 200 hours of testimony, discussing operations in minute detail, explaining German decision-making processes, analysing what had worked and what had failed. His cooperation was pragmatic calculation. The war was over. Germany was occupied and divided. The information he provided was historical, useful for military analysis, but posing no security threat. In exchange for cooperation, he received better treatment, private quarters rather than crowded barracks, access to books and writing materials, permission to correspond with family. Most importantly, cooperation built relationships with American officers who might influence his eventual disposition. The alternative, refusing to cooperate, would accomplish nothing except ensuring harsher treatment. Manteuffel was always pragmatic. He had served Hitler's regime when service offered possibility of success. Now, he served American interrogators when service offered possibility of release. The question of war crimes prosecution shadowed Manteuffel's captivity throughout 1946. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, prosecuting major Nazi leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. By extension, the trials examined Wehrmacht's institutional role in Nazi crimes. The prosecution documented Wehrmacht participation in illegal orders, the Commissar Order authorizing execution of Soviet political officers, the Barbarossa Decree exempting German soldiers from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians, the Commando Order requiring execution of captured Allied special forces. Wehrmacht generals testified, some defending their actions, others claiming they had resisted illegal orders privately while obeying them publicly. The question facing every captured German officer was whether they would face prosecution for command responsibility. February 1946 brought Soviet extradition request. The USSR demanded Manteuffel's transfer to Soviet custody to face charges related to operations in occupied Soviet territory. The charges were vague war crimes committed by units under his command, destruction of civilian property, reprisals against partisans. Soviet requests for extradition typically resulted in show trials and execution or lengthy imprisonment in Siberian labor camps. Manteuffel, learning of the request, understood his life balanced on bureaucratic decision by American authorities. If extradited to Soviet custody, he would likely not survive. His fate depended on American willingness to protect German POWs from Soviet justice. The American decision to deny Soviet extradition reflected emerging Cold War politics more than concern for Manteuffel personally. By 1946, Allied cooperation was fracturing. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, Stalin's refusal to allow free elections, communist expansion in Asia, these developments were creating Western perception that Soviet Union was an emerging threat. German military expertise about Soviet tactics and capabilities suddenly became valuable for potential future conflict. Manteuffel had fought Soviets for 3 years, understood Red Army operational methods, could brief American planners on Soviet strengths and weaknesses. This made him asset rather than liability. The extradition request was denied. Manteuffel remained in American custody, spared Soviet justice, but still facing uncertain future, May 1947. The High Command trial at Nuremberg prosecuted 14 Wehrmacht generals for war crimes and crimes against peace. The prosecution's theory was that Wehrmacht High Command had been criminal organisation, that planning aggressive war and implementing illegal orders constituted individual criminal liability for senior officers. Several defendants were convicted and sentenced to lengthy imprisonment, others were acquitted. Manteuffel was not charged, not called as defendant. He testified as witness, describing military operations, explaining command structures, answering questions about orders and their implementation. His testimony was careful, factual, avoiding political commentary. He described operations without defending them, acknowledged orders without claiming ignorance of their implications. The reason Manteuffel escaped prosecution was partly evidentiary, partly political. Evidentiary: no documented evidence existed of Manteuffel personally ordering war crimes or directly participating in atrocities. His combat record showed aggressive but generally conventional military operations. Partisan warfare in Soviet territories was brutal, but proving specific command responsibility for specific war crimes required documentation often destroyed in war's chaos. By 1947, Allied priorities were shifting. Comprehensive prosecution of Wehrmacht officers was yielding to pragmatic recognition that German military expertise was valuable, that some former enemies might become future allies against Soviet expansion. The calculus was cynical but clear. Manteuffel's usefulness as military consultant outweighed value of prosecuting him for possible but unproven crimes. October 1947 brought an offer that illustrated Allied priorities perfectly. American Historical Division invited Manteuffel to join Foreign Military Studies Program, a project employing former Wehrmacht officers to write detailed analyses of World War II operations from German perspective. The work would be compensated, would allow relative freedom of movement within American occupation zone, would provide opportunity to shape historical understanding of the war. The implicit exchange was obvious. German officers would provide military analysis, Americans would provide rehabilitation and protection from further prosecution. Manteuffel accepted. By early 1948, he was essentially free, residing in Neustadt, writing tactical studies, consulting with American officers, preparing for potential conflict with Soviet Union. The transition from enemy general to Allied consultant required cognitive compartmentalization that Manteuffel managed with characteristic pragmatism. He had served Nazi Germany because he was German officer and Germany was his nation. Now he served American occupation authorities because they controlled Germany and offered opportunity for productive work. His loyalty was not to ideology but to professional identity as soldier and German national. This flexibility enabled survival and rehabilitation, but also revealed moral ambiguity at his core. He had served evil regime without apparently being evil himself, had enabled genocide without participating directly, had fought for tyranny while considering himself professional soldier rather than political actor. These contradictions would define his post-war reputation. Was he complicit or merely competent, criminal or professional? The answer was probably both, in ways that neat moral categories could not capture. Manteuffel was survivor, and survival in 20th century Germany required accommodations that perfect moral clarity would have made impossible. November 20, 1945. Nuremberg, Germany. The courtroom in the Palace of Justice was cold, both literally and atmospherically. 21 Nazi leaders sat in the dock, facing charges that would define how future generations understood state criminality. Among the defendants were names that had once commanded nations and armies: Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl. The prosecution's case was unprecedented in international law. These men would be held individually responsible for crimes committed by the state they served, for aggressive war and crimes against humanity and genocide. The trial was theatre and law and history, simultaneously an attempt to impose justice on scale of atrocity that exceeded traditional legal frameworks. Hasso von Manteuffel watching from the witness gallery before giving his own testimony, understood that Nuremberg represented judgment not just on Nazi leadership, but on everyone who had served Hitler's regime. The question was not whether the Nazi state was criminal, that was established by overwhelming evidence. The question was how far down the command chain individual criminal responsibility extended. The prosecution's strategy targeted Wehrmacht complicity specifically. The Allies wanted to destroy the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the self-serving narrative that Nazi crimes had been perpetrated by SS and party organizations, while regular military remained honorable. Documents introduced as evidence destroyed this myth systematically. The Commissar Order, issued June 1941, required Wehrmacht units to execute Soviet political officers immediately upon capture. The Barbarossa Decree, issued May 1941, exempted German soldiers from prosecution for crimes against Soviet civilians. The Commando Order, issued October 1942, mandated execution of Allied Special Forces soldiers, even if captured in uniform. The Hostage Order authorized mass reprisals against civilian populations in response to partisan activity. Each of these orders bore Wehrmacht distribution, had been transmitted through military channels, had been implemented by regular army units. The SS had perpetrated most direct killing in Holocaust, but Wehrmacht had enabled it, supported it, participated in it. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Wehrmacht High Command and Chief of Operations Staff respectively, sat in the dock representing military leadership's complicity. Their defence followed predictable pattern. They had followed orders from Hitler, had lacked authority to refuse illegal directives, had been professional soldiers rather than political actors. The prosecution dismantled this. Defence by demonstrating that senior officers had agency, had made choices, had sometimes protested orders while implementing them. The concept of superior orders as absolute defence was rejected. Nuremberg established principle that individuals remain responsible for criminal acts even when ordered by superiors, that professional duty does not override moral duty to refuse participating in atrocities. Manteuffel's testimony came on November 27th, called as prosecution witness to describe Wehrmacht command structure and operational planning. He testified for 4 hours, answering questions about how orders flowed from Hitler through Wehrmacht, high command to field armies, how operational directives were translated into tactical orders, what discretion commanders possessed in implementing directives. His testimony was factually accurate and strategically evasive simultaneously. He described systems without condemning them, explained processes without judging them, provided information without offering moral commentary. When prosecution asked whether he had received illegal orders, Manteuffel acknowledged receiving directives for harsh treatment of partisans, but claimed such orders were modified during implementation to comply with laws of war. Whether this was truth or self-serving fabrication was impossible to prove decades later. The question of partisan warfare was particularly fraught. Operations against Soviet partisans had been brutal, often involving collective punishment of villages suspected of supporting resistance fighters, execution of captured partisans without trial, destruction of food supplies to deny partisan support. These operations existed in grey zone between legitimate counterinsurgency and war crimes. Wehrmacht argued that partisans operating without uniforms forfeited protection of Geneva Conventions, that harsh measures were militarily necessary to protect supply lines. Prosecution argued that collective punishment and summary execution constituted war crimes, regardless of military necessity. Manteuffel's units had operated in partisan-infested areas of Ukraine and Belarusia. Had they participated in reprisals? Almost certainly. Could specific war crimes be documented with evidence sufficient for prosecution? Not reliably, given chaos of retreat and destruction of records. February 1946 brought the moment of greatest danger for Manteuffel personally. Soviet prosecutors demanded his extradition to face charges in Moscow. The Soviet case alleged that 5th Panzer Army, during operations in Ukraine in 1944, had participated in reprisal killings against civilians, had destroyed villages beyond military necessity, had failed to prevent war crimes by subordinate units. The evidence presented was a mix of genuine documentation and Soviet propaganda. Villages had been destroyed, this was undeniable. Whether destruction was legitimate military action against partisan bases or criminal. Reprisal against civilians was an interpretive question. Soviet justice system did not make such distinctions carefully. Extradition meant show trial, conviction, likely execution, or decades in Siberian labor camp. Western allies' decision to deny Soviet extradition request reflected multiple calculations. Evidence was insufficient to prove individual criminal responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Political. By 1946, Cold War tensions were rising, making cooperation with Soviet prosecution less attractive. Practical. Manteuffel was providing valuable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities, making him more useful as consultant than as defendant. Western occupation authorities privately doubted Soviet justice system would provide fair trial. Suspected extradition would be death sentence. The decision was pragmatic rather than principled, calculated based on perceived Western interests rather than abstract justice. Manteuffel was protected not because he was innocent, but because protecting him served Allied purposes. May 1947. The High Command trial, officially United States versus Wilhelm von Lieb et al., prosecuted 14 Wehrmacht generals for war crimes, crimes against peace, and membership in criminal organization. The defendants included field marshals and army group commanders who had served on Eastern Front, men who had commanded operations where Wehrmacht's darkest crimes occurred. The prosecution documented systematic Wehrmacht participation in Holocaust, in Commissar order implementation, in hostage-taking and reprisal killings. Several defendants were convicted and sentenced to terms ranging from 3 years to life imprisonment. Others were acquitted. The verdicts were legally defensible but morally unsatisfying. Men who had commanded armies that killed millions received sentences measured in single-digit years. Manteuffel was not charged in High Command trial despite having commanded forces in occupied Soviet territory where war crimes occurred. The reasons were partly legal. He had been division and army commander rather than army group commander, placing him below the organizational level prosecution targeted. Partly evidentiary-specific documentation linking him to specific crimes was lacking. Partly practical. By 1947, comprehensive prosecution of all potentially culpable Wehrmacht officers was recognized as impossible, requiring resources and time occupation authorities were unwilling to invest. The decision to exclude Manteuffel from prosecution was made by prosecutors reviewing case files, weighing evidence, making judgment calls about which cases were strongest. His exclusion did not prove innocence, only that evidence was insufficient or priorities lay elsewhere. The moral questions Nuremberg raised transcended legal verdicts. The tribunal established that aggressive war was crime, that following orders was not absolute defence, that individuals retained responsibility for criminal acts regardless of superior directives. These principles were important but incomplete. They addressed extreme cases, genocide, mass murder, systematic atrocity. They did not adequately address the moral status of professional soldiers serving criminal regime without directly participating in its worst crimes. Was every Wehrmacht officer who fought on Eastern Front guilty by association with regime that perpetrated Holocaust? Were soldiers who enabled Nazi Germany's continued existence through military competence complicit in genocide? These questions admitted no clear answers. Manteuffel had not staffed concentration camps, had not personally executed civilians, had not participated directly in Holocaust, but his tactical brilliance had prolonged Nazi Germany's existence, had kept Wehrmacht fighting longer, had enabled regime to continue its extermination program for additional months. This constituted complicity by enabling rather than direct participation. Nuremberg prosecuted direct perpetrators but left unresolved the moral status of competent professionals who served criminal state without personally committing its signature crimes. Manteuffel's own reflection on Nuremberg, recorded in his memoirs years later, was characteristically evasive. He acknowledged Wehrmacht had operated in an environment where atrocities occurred, claimed he had personally resisted illegal orders when possible, insisted his focus had been tactical operations rather than political implementation. He never adequately addressed whether fighting skillfully for Nazi Germany constituted moral failure, whether professional excellence in service of evil regime was itself evil. The question remained open, unresolved, a moral ambiguity that would shadow every Wehrmacht officer who survived the war. They had been good at their profession. Their profession had enabled genocide. How should history judge professional competence deployed in service of ultimate evil? Nuremberg provided legal answers, prosecute those with direct responsibility, establish principles for future conduct, hold individuals accountable for their choices. It did not provide moral answers sufficient to resolve the contradiction of honourable men serving dishonourable cause. That contradiction would define how post-war Germany remembered its Wehrmacht and how Manteuffel remembered himself. June 1950. Neustadt, West Germany. The message arrived in unmarked envelope, delivered by American military courier who waited for response. Inside was invitation from United States Army Historical Division requesting Hasso von Manteuffel's participation in special conference analysing Soviet armoured tactics. The conference would include former Wehrmacht officers who had fought on Eastern Front, American military planners concerned about potential conflict with USSR, intelligence analysts studying Red Army capabilities. Attendance was voluntary but compensated. Transportation and lodging would be provided. The unstated subtext was clear. 5 years after Germany's surrender, former enemies were becoming informal allies against new threat. Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe, communist takeover of China, Berlin blockade, emerging nuclear standoff, these developments were transforming World War II's victors and vanquished into Cold War's opposing camps. Wehrmacht officers who had fought Soviets possessed expertise, suddenly valuable to Western militaries planning for potential Third World War. Manteuffel's decision to accept was pragmatic rather than ideological. He was 53 years old, living in occupied Germany where economic devastation and political uncertainty made every day precarious. The invitation offered compensation that exceeded anything available in war-ruined German economy. More importantly, it offered rehabilitation. Participating in American military conferences implicitly certified that he was acceptable advisor rather than war criminal, professional soldier rather than Nazi collaborator. The psychological need for rehabilitation was perhaps stronger than financial need. Manteuffel's self-conception remained tied to professional military identity. Being treated as expert rather than prisoner validated that identity, provided continuity between his wartime service and post-war existence. He accepted the invitation within hours. The conference, held at American military installation near Frankfurt in July 1950, gathered 32 former Wehrmacht officers and 45 American military personnel. The agenda was purely tactical, analysing Soviet combined arms doctrine, assessing vulnerabilities in Soviet operational methods, developing countermeasures to Soviet numerical superiority. Political questions were carefully avoided. No one discussed Nazi ideology or Holocaust or Wehrmacht complicity. The focus was professional military analysis stripped of political context. This suited Manteuffel perfectly. He could discuss tank tactics and operational planning without addressing uncomfortable questions about whom he had served and what that service had enabled. The Americans wanted his expertise, not his moral reckoning. He provided what they wanted. His presentations impressed American attendees with detailed tactical knowledge and analytical rigor. Manteuffel discussed Soviet deep operations doctrine, explaining how Red Army used multiple echelons to maintain offensive momentum, how Soviet commanders accepted staggering casualties to achieve breakthrough, how Soviet logistics differed fundamentally from German approaches. He analysed Soviet tank design philosophy, comparing 34's reliability and producibility versus German emphasis on technical sophistication and armour protection. He briefed on Soviet artillery employment, describing how Red Army used artillery in mass to compensate for inferior tactical coordination. The briefings were valuable, precisely because they came from someone who had fought against Soviet forces for 3 years and survived. Manteuffel's observations were empirical, based on battlefield experience rather than theoretical study. October 1950 brought development that transformed these informal consultations into something more significant. North Korean forces, equipped and advised by Soviets, invaded South Korea. American forces, committed to defending South Korea under UN mandate, suddenly faced combat against Soviet-trained army using Soviet tactics. The tactical knowledge former Wehrmacht officers possessed became immediately operationally relevant. American units encountering Soviet-built 34 tanks in Korea benefited from German experience fighting same tanks in Russia. American commanders facing Soviet-style combined arms attacks drew on Wehrmacht analyses of Soviet operational methods. The Korean War accelerated German military rehabilitation because it demonstrated that Cold War might involve actual combat requiring practical rather than theoretical understanding of Soviet capabilities. The Himmerod Conference, October 1950, represented watershed in German remilitarization. Former Wehrmacht officers, including Manteuffel, met with West German political leaders to discuss creation of new West German military. The strategic situation was clear. Soviet Union had 400,000 troops in East Germany. NATO needed West German contribution to defend Western Europe. German rearmament was necessary despite being politically controversial barely 5 years after Wehrmacht's surrender. The conference participants drafted memorandum outlining principles for new military, democratic civilian control, integration into NATO structure, emphasis on professional volunteers rather than mass conscription, explicit rejection of Wehrmacht traditions associated with Nazism. The Himmerod Memorandum became blueprint for Bundeswehr, West Germany's future armed forces. Manteuffel's role at Himmerod was advisory rather than leadership. He contributed tactical doctrine proposals, particularly regarding armoured warfare and mobile defence against numerically superior Soviet forces. His recommendations reflected lessons learned painfully on Eastern Front, importance of combined arms coordination, necessity of defending in depth rather than linear positions, value of operational reserves for counterattacks, critical role of logistics in sustaining operations. These were professional military judgments, divorced from political ideology. Whether Manteuffel recognized irony of using knowledge gained serving Nazi Germany to now serve democratic West Germany is unclear from historical record. Probably he saw no irony, viewed military service as professional calling independent of political system being served. This moral flexibility, some would call it moral blindness, was characteristic of his generation of German officers. 1953 brought American congressional testimony. House Armed Services Committee, assessing Soviet military threat, invited Manteuffel to testify about Red Army capabilities based on his wartime experience. The invitation demonstrated how completely he had been rehabilitated in American eyes. 8 years after surrendering as enemy general, he was expert witness before American legislature. His testimony covered Soviet tactical doctrine, equipment capabilities, likely strategies for potential European conflict. Committee members questioned him about Soviet weaknesses, vulnerabilities that NATO forces might exploit. Manteufel's responses were detailed and professionally delivered. The substance was valuable. The context was surreal. German general who had fought for Hitler now advising American government about Soviet threat. 1955 brought West Germany's formal admission to NATO and creation of Bundeswehr. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's government offered Manteuffel position in new military rank equivalent to his wartime command, responsibility for developing armoured doctrine. Manteuffel declined. He was 58 years old, recognised that new military should be led by younger generation without personal connections to Wehrmacht and Nazi regime. More honestly, he doubted his capacity to serve in democratic military under civilian control after career spent in authoritarian structure. The Bundeswehr would be fundamentally different from Wehrmacht soldiers, were citizens in uniform with legal right to refuse illegal orders. Political education emphasized democratic values. Integration into NATO meant German forces served alliance rather than national ambitions. These were positive changes, but also represented repudiation of everything Prussian military tradition had valued. Manteuffel, product of that tradition, recognized he belonged to past rather than future. His contribution to Bundeswehr was doctrinal rather than organizational. Tactical manuals for German armoured forces incorporated Manteufel's analyses of mobile warfare, his emphasis on reconnaissance and combined arms coordination, his understanding of defensive operations in depth. NATO's strategy for defending West Germany against potential Soviet invasion used operational concepts Manteuffel had helped develop. The irony was profound. Military doctrine designed to stop Soviet expansion was authored partially by men who had fought to expand Nazi Germany eastward. Cold War's exigencies created strange rehabilitations and stranger continuities. Manteuffel's expertise was valuable regardless of source. That expertise came from serving criminal regime was uncomfortable, fact that pragmatic Cold War calculations subordinated to strategic necessity. The moral questions raised by Manteufel's Cold War service were largely unasked during the 1950s. West Germany needed defending, NATO needed German military contribution, former Wehrmacht officers possessed relevant expertise. These practical necessities overrode difficult questions about rehabilitation of men who had served Hitler. Only later, in 1960s and after, would younger Germans begin questioning their father's generation, demanding accounting for what service to Nazi regime had entailed. Manteuffel would face those questions eventually. In the 1950s, he enjoyed rehabilitation that was politically motivated but personally gratifying. He was, again expert, again valued, again contributing to military efforts. That these efforts now served democracy rather than tyranny probably mattered to him. That his service to tyranny had been prerequisite for his expertise was contradiction he never satisfactorily resolved. He served because serving was his identity. Whether that identity required more careful moral discrimination about whom he served, he never adequately answered. September 6, 1953. Bonn, West Germany. Hasso von Manteuffel walked through the halls of the Bundeshaus, West Germany's provisional parliament building, with the cautious uncertainty of a man entering unfamiliar territory. He had commanded armies across 3 continents, had made decisions affecting thousands of lives, had operated in environments where clarity of purpose and chain of command were absolute. Politics was different, messy, ambiguous, requiring skills he had never cultivated. Yet here he was, newly elected member of the Bundestag, representing Schleswig-Holstein constituency, wearing civilian suit that felt wrong after decades in uniform, preparing to take oath to democratic constitution. The Free Democratic Party had recruited him specifically for his name recognition and military reputation. Veterans voted, their families voted, and Hasso von Manteuffel was named that carried weight in communities still processing Germany's catastrophic defeat and searching for figures who represented competence amid chaos. The FDP's appeal to Manteuffel was calculated on both sides. The party needed candidates with national prominence who were not tainted by obvious Nazi associations. Manteuffel had served Hitler's regime but had never joined Nazi Party, had been professional soldier rather than ideological warrior, had emerged from war crimes, investigations without prosecution. This made him acceptable to voters who wanted to honour Wehrmacht service while distancing themselves from Nazi criminality. For Manteuffel, the FDP offered political rehabilitation and public platform. The party's ideology, classical liberalism, free market economics, individual rights, European integration, was foreign to his Prussian conservative background. But ideology mattered less than opportunity. Politics offered post-military career with status and influence. He accepted candidacy with same pragmatic calculation that had characterised his entire life. His campaign in Schleswig-Holstein exploited military reputation explicitly. Campaign materials featured his photograph in Wehrmacht uniform, identified him as General von Manteuffel, emphasised his decorations and commands. The message was implicit but clear. Vote for man who had fought for Germany, who embodied military excellence, who represented continuity with better past before defeat and occupation. That this past included service to genocidal regime was acknowledged obliquely, if at all. Campaign speeches emphasised veterans' rights, reconstruction of German economy, restoration of national sovereignty. Political opponents from Social Democratic Party attempted to raise questions about Manteufel's wartime service, his role in operations where atrocities occurred, his relationship with Nazi leadership. These attacks mostly failed. In 1953, West Germany, voters were more interested in rebuilding future than interrogating past. Election results confirmed FDP's calculation. Manteuffel won his constituency with 53% of vote, carrying overwhelming majorities in rural areas and among veterans. His victory was part of broader trend. Multiple former Wehrmacht officers entered Bundestag in 1953 elections, representing various parties, all capitalising on military reputation. West German democracy in its early years incorporated substantial continuity with previous regimes' personnel, particularly in military and administrative spheres. This continuity was pragmatic. Necessity, new state needed experienced administrators. Germany needed defending. Voters wanted familiar faces in positions of authority. But it also meant that West Germany's democratic institutions were staffed partially by men whose previous service had enabled dictatorship. Manteufel's committee assignments revealed FDP's intentions for his parliamentary role. He joined Defence Committee, where his military expertise was relevant, and Foreign Affairs Committee, where his combat experience against Soviets provided credentials for discussing Cold War policy. His actual influence on legislation was minimal. He was freshman parliamentarian in Junior Coalition Party, lacking seniority or parliamentary skills, but his symbolic value was significant. When Bundestag debated Bundeswehr creation, Manteuffels' speeches supporting military integration into NATO carried weight precisely because former Wehrmacht general was endorsing democratic civilian control of military. His presence implied that professional military officers could serve democracy faithfully, that Wehrmacht traditions could be selectively retained while rejecting Nazi contamination. 1954 brought parliamentary debate on veterans' pensions, issue with enormous political salience and moral complexity. Millions of former Wehrmacht soldiers lived in West Germany, many disabled by war wounds, most struggling economically in still recovering economy. Veterans' organisations demanded pensions equivalent to what they would have received had Wehrmacht remained institutionally continuous. Opposition parties argued that providing full pensions to men who had fought for Nazi Germany constituted rewarding service to criminal regime. Manteuffel spoke passionately for veterans' legislation, arguing that soldiers had served nation rather than ideology, that military service deserved recognition regardless of political system being served, that distinguishing between German nation and Nazi regime was both possible and necessary. His speech was effective politically and troubling morally. The argument that Wehrmacht had fought for Germany rather than Nazism was exactly the clean Wehrmacht myth that Nuremberg had attempted to dismantle. Wehrmacht had not been separate from Nazi regime, but integral to its functioning, had enabled genocide through military conquests that brought Jews under Nazi control, had participated directly in occupation policies that killed millions. Yet Manteuffels' argument resonated with German public, eager to honour fathers and sons and husbands who had served. Veterans' pension legislation passed with broad support, including votes from Social Democrats who had initially opposed it. The political consensus reflected West German society's collective decision to separate Wehrmacht service from Nazi criminality, to honour military sacrifice while condemning political leadership. This separation was psychologically necessary for national reconciliation, but historically problematic. The Suez Crisis of 1956 brought Manteuffels' most significant parliamentary intervention. Britain and France, allied with Israel, invaded Egypt to seize Suez Canal after Egyptian nationalisation. United States opposed invasion, pressured allies to withdraw, created significant NATO tension. Bundestag debated West Germany's position. Conservative parties supported Britain and France, argued for European solidarity against Third World nationalism. FDP was divided. Manteuffel spoke against supporting the invasion, argued that colonial military adventurism was precisely the kind of aggressive war that had destroyed Germany, insisted that West Germany's future lay in defensive alliance focused on Soviet threat rather than neo-imperial expeditions. His speech was notable for acknowledging, however obliquely, that German aggressive wars had been mistakes. Coming from a man who had commanded forces in Poland and France and Russia, this constituted unusual self-awareness. Whether his opposition to Suez reflected genuine learning from Germany's catastrophic militarism or pragmatic calculation about Cold War priorities was unclear. 1957 brought Manteuffels' re-election to second Bundestag term, again with comfortable majority. His second term focused increasingly on European economic community integration, predecessor to European Union. Manteuffel supported EEC membership enthusiastically, argued that European economic integration would prevent future European wars, insisted that German sovereignty could be exercised through supranational institutions rather than national militarism. This represented remarkable evolution for man, whose career had been devoted to German military power. Whether evolution was genuine ideological conversion or pragmatic recognition that nationalism had failed catastrophically was debatable, probably both. Manteuffel was always pragmatist. European integration was working, was creating prosperity, was rebuilding German influence through economics rather than military force. He supported what worked. His parliamentary career was unremarkable by conventional measures. He authored no major legislation, led no significant policy initiatives, built no lasting political legacy. His significance was symbolic rather than substantive. He represented veterans' integration into democratic politics, military professionalism's compatibility with civilian authority, possibility that former servants of tyranny could become defenders of democracy. These were important symbols for West German democracy's consolidation. They were also morally complicated symbols because they required forgetting or minimizing what Wehrmacht service had actually entailed. Manteufel's presence in democratic parliament said that past could be transcended, that Germans who had served evil regime could become citizens of democratic state. This message was politically necessary and historically incomplete. By 1959, when Manteuffel announced he would not seek third term, his political rehabilitation was complete. He had served 2 terms in democratic parliament, had contributed to debates about defence and foreign policy, had represented transition from defeated dictatorship to functioning democracy. His retirement from politics at 62 was attributed to age and desire for private life. More accurately, he recognised that his symbolic value was declining as West Germany's democracy matured and political culture evolved beyond needing Wehrmacht generals to legitimise democratic institutions. Younger generation was entering politics, people whose formative experiences were post-war democracy rather than wartime service. Manteuffel's political career had served its purpose, integrating veterans into democratic politics, demonstrating that military professionalism could serve democracy. That purpose accomplished, he retired to Bavaria, to writing memoirs and giving occasional interviews, to life as historical figure rather than active political participant. The contradictions of his service to dictatorship and democracy, both to military excellence and political evil, remained unresolved, but they were now someone else's problem to judge. September 24, 1978, Diesenam am See, Bavaria. Hasso von Manteuffel died quietly in his sleep at age 81 in the lakeside house where he had spent his retirement years writing and reflecting. His death came without drama, without final deathbed revelations, without resolution of the contradictions that had defined his life. The obituaries struggled with how to summarize him. Military publications emphasized his tactical brilliance, called him one of World War II's most skilled armored commanders, praised his defensive expertise and operational flexibility. Political publications noted his democratic service, his Bundestag terms, his support for European integration. Historical publications wrestled with more difficult questions: how to assess military excellence deployed in service of genocidal regime, how to weigh post-war democratic service against wartime enabling of Nazi criminality, how to judge man who excelled at his profession when that profession enabled horror. The funeral in Munich attracted unexpected diversity of mourners. Wehrmacht veterans, now elderly men in civilian clothes, came to honour commander they had served under. Bundeswehr officers attended, recognising Manteuffel's influence on German military doctrine despite his Wehrmacht service. FDP politicians appeared, acknowledging his parliamentary contributions. Conspicuously absent were representatives from Jewish organisations, Holocaust survivors, groups representing Nazi victims. Their absence was statement whatever Manteuffel's tactical brilliance or post-war service, he remained a figure whose career was inseparable from a regime that had murdered millions. The funeral thus became microcosm of divided memory about Wehrmacht and its officers. Some honoured their service, others could not separate professional competence from moral complicity. The memoirs Manteuffel had published in 1965 provided his own accounting, characteristically incomplete. The book focused almost entirely on tactical and operational matters, battles described in detail, decisions explained, outcomes analysed. Political context appeared minimally. Nazi ideology was barely mentioned. Holocaust was acknowledged in single paragraph expressing horror at discoveries after war ended. The memoir was professional soldiers' account of professional warfare, studiously avoiding larger questions about what that warfare had enabled. Critics noted this evasion, pointed out that Manteuffel's tactical brilliance had prolonged Nazi regime's existence, that every day Wehrmacht resisted Allied advances was another day concentration camps operated. Defenders argued that military memoirs should address military operations, that soldiers were not responsible for political crimes, that tactical excellence could be assessed separate from strategic context. Military historians' assessment of Manteuffel generally ranked him among top 10 German tactical commanders of World War II. His strengths were reconnaissance, emphasis, combined arms coordination, flexible defence, rapid operational adaptation. His campaigns demonstrated consistent pattern achieving surprise through unconventional approaches, maximising combat power through efficient logistics, preserving forces through fighting withdrawals when necessary. The Targu Frumos battles showed his defensive mastery. The Ardennes offensive showed his ability to plan and execute complex operations despite insufficient resources. The Ruhr Pocket withdrawal showed his skill at minimizing casualties in impossible situations. These were genuine military accomplishments deserving professional respect. But military assessment isolated from moral assessment was incomplete. Manteuffel's tactical innovations served strategic evil. His defensive brilliance prolonged war that killed millions. His skill at preserving German combat power meant Wehrmacht remained effective fighting force longer, which meant Holocaust continued longer, meant more civilians died under Nazi occupation, meant more soldiers died on both sides. The counterfactual was impossible to prove, but logically compelling. Had Wehrmacht been commanded entirely by incompetent officers, Germany would have lost faster, fewer people would have died. Manteuffel's competence thus created negative value by extending catastrophic war's duration. This was not his intention, but was nonetheless a result of his actions. The question of moral responsibility haunted every assessment of Wehrmacht officers who served competently but were not prosecuted for war crimes. Legal responsibility was clear. Nuremberg principles established that following orders was not absolute defense, that command responsibility existed for crimes committed by subordinate units. But Manteuffel's case fell into grey zone, where evidence was insufficient for prosecution, despite probability of some complicity. He had commanded forces in occupied territories where atrocities occurred. He had implemented orders for harsh treatment of partisans. He had served regime whose criminal nature was obvious by 1943 at latest, yet specific evidence linking him to specific war crimes was lacking, or destroyed. Legal system required proof beyond reasonable doubt. Historical judgment could operate with lower standard but also lacked definitive evidence. Bundeswehr's relationship with Manteuffel's legacy illustrated West German military's complicated connection to Wehrmacht past. His tactical writings influenced armour doctrine through 1980s. Combat training incorporated his principles about combined arms coordination and defensive operations. Officer education used his campaigns as case studies in operational planning. But Bundeswehr also explicitly rejected Wehrmacht traditions associated with Nazism. No naming barracks after Wehrmacht generals, no portraits of Hitler-era officers in official buildings, mandatory education about Holocaust and Wehrmacht complicity. Manteuffel thus existed in Bundeswehr memory as tactical exemplar whose broader service was problematic. His methods were valued, while his wartime loyalties were implicitly condemned. The historical reassessment that began in 1980s, as new generation of German historians examined Wehrmacht's role in Holocaust more critically, was devastating to clean Wehrmacht myth that Manteuffel embodied. Research demonstrated that Wehrmacht had been deeply complicit in genocide, that regular army units had participated in mass shootings of Jews, that military administration of occupied territories had enabled Holocaust's implementation, that Wehrmacht cooperation with SS had been extensive and willing. This scholarship destroyed comfortable narrative that separated military professionalism from Nazi criminality. Wehrmacht officers, like Manteuffel, could no longer claim they had fought honourable war while Nazi regime committed separate crimes. Wehrmacht's war and Nazi crimes were inseparable. Manteuffel's own final assessment, given in 1971 interview with British military historian Basil Liddell Hart, was characteristically evasive about moral questions, while clear about tactical matters. Asked about his wartime service, Manteuffel said, "I was soldier, not politician. I fought for Germany as I understood Germany, which was nation and people rather than ideology. Whether that distinction was valid or whether my service enabled evil, regardless of intentions, I cannot judge. History will make that judgment." Asked whether he would have served differently with benefit of hindsight, he responded, "I would have asked more questions about what my military victories were enabling. But I am not certain I would have acted differently. My duty, as I understood it, was to command soldiers competently, preserve their lives when possible, accomplish missions assigned. That understanding may have been morally insufficient but was psychologically inescapable given my training and beliefs. These answers were honest in acknowledging uncertainty while insufficient in accepting responsibility." Manteuffel recognised moral complexity of his situation but declined to render judgment on himself. This reflected both genuine philosophical humility and convenient moral evasion. He could not judge himself meant he avoided declaring himself guilty, which would require confronting what guilt demanded: repentance, reparation, acknowledgement of victims. He remained until death in psychological space, where he recognized problems with his wartime service while declining to condemn that service categorically. This ambivalence was probably psychologically necessary for functioning. Genuine moral reckoning might have been psychologically unbearable. The final judgment on Hasso von Manteuffel remains contested because it requires weighing incommensurables. His tactical brilliance was genuine. His service to genocidal regime was undeniable. His post-war democratic service was real, but did not erase wartime complicity. He was simultaneously skillful soldier and enabler of evil, professional officer and servant of criminality, tactical genius and moral failure. Modern historical assessment tends toward harsh judgment that military excellence deployed in service of Nazi Germany constitutes complicity regardless of personal participation in specific atrocities, that professional competence that prolongs evil is itself evil. This judgment is defensible but also incomplete because it reduces complex human to simple moral category. Manteuffel was product of Prussian military tradition that valued duty and obedience as supreme virtues, that treated political questions as outside military competence, that defined honor as professional excellence rather than moral questioning. This tradition produced extraordinary military capabilities and catastrophic moral failures. It created soldiers who could command armies brilliantly while serving regimes that murdered millions. Manteuffel embodied both tradition's strengths and failures. He was what that tradition produced: tactically superb, operationally innovative, strategically obedient, morally limited. Judging him requires judging entire military culture that shaped him, entire society that created that culture, entire historical trajectory that led from Prussian virtues to Nazi crimes. The lakeside grave in Bavaria where Manteuffel rests bears simple inscription: name, dates, nothing more. No military rank, no decorations, no epitaph. The simplicity reflects family's recognition that any summary of his life would be controversial. Wehrmacht veteran enables those who honor his military service. War criminal who escaped prosecution gives ammunition to those who condemn. Democratic parliamentarian emphasizes rehabilitation while minimizing complicity. Tactical genius ignores moral context. The grave silence acknowledges that Hasso von Manteuffels' life admits no simple judgment, only recognition that he lived through terrible times, made choices that ranged from brilliant to catastrophic, served causes both evil and democratic, and left legacy that remains profoundly controversial. He was man of his time and victim of his time and agent of his time's horrors. History remembers him as all of these, which means history's judgment remains forever divided, as perhaps it must be when assessing those who were simultaneously perpetrators and products of 20th century's catastrophes.